for quite short-term actions by the President, generally completed well within the 60-90-day period.
Lawmakers and the President have debated the constitutionality of the War Powers Act since its passage.
The court might finally decide whether or not the President had failed to comply with the War Powers Act and whether the War Powers Act was constitutional.
A group of current or former U.S. government officials told Senate investigators today that American Vietnam War veterans could still be alive in Southeast Asia. They added it is possible that some might be there voluntarily. That was the focus today of a hearing of the Senate Select Committee on POW MIA affairs. For about 4 hours, members continued their probe into reports of live sightings of American servicemen in that part of the world. Members heard from 3 men who played key government roles in trying to find U.S. prisoners. Coming next on C-SPAN, we'll hear the testimony of Lieutenant General Leonard Peroots, former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Richard Childress, a staffer with the National Security Council, and Richard Armitage, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense. The Select Committee is chaired by Senator John Kerry, a Massachusetts Democrat, and himself a Vietnam-era veteran of the Navy.
Bill. The hearing will come to order. I apologize to all for the delay. We were in executive session with the station chief from Laos, and it took a little longer than we expected. And other members are still, in fact, up there with him now, which is why we are only part of a committee here, but we're going to proceed so that we can get through today's schedule, hopefully on time. We welcome today General Leonard Peroots, who was DIA director from 1985 to 1988, Richard Childress of the NSC staff during the Reagan administration, and Richard Armitage, who was in the Department of Defense during the course of the Reagan administration, all of whom have had responsibilities with respect to the POW MIA issue. Gentlemen, we welcome you today. I thank you for taking time. I know you've already spent time with staff, and we are appreciative to you for that. If you would stand so that I could swear you in, and then we'll proceed. Raise your right hands. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. I understand, General, you're going to lead off with an opening statement, and
it's only appropriate.
Others of you may have statements, and then we'll proceed. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Smith, do you have any opening?
I'll defer for the moment, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Brown. General.
Mr. Chairman, if I look somewhat disheveled, I watch the hearings all night long. You'll be commended for your the manner in which you conduct these investigations and the strength you have in continuing the effort for so many long hours. I'd like to begin by congratulating you and your committee for your efforts to shed more light on this critical and emotional POW MIA issue, an issue that virtually dominated my thoughts and actions as director of DIA for over 3 years. I have earlier provided deposition to the committee as requested, However, in view of the subsequent recent developments resulting from your hearings on 24 July, Mr. Chairman, I not only welcome the opportunity to appear here in open testimony, but contacted Senator McCain and requested that I be given an opportunity to address this committee to respond to certain allegations that were made during that session. I felt I needed to do this to set the record straight. In this prepared statement, I will directly respond point by point to the questions that your committee staff provided. I am struck by the fact that by far most of the questions relate to my association with Mr. Ross Perot. But after watching 6 hours of the testimony, I have a better understanding of why those questions appeared. While I can understand the interest and indeed in some cases the relevancy of Mr. Perot's involvement as it applies to me and DIA under my tenure, I find it interesting that there were no questions regarding the multitude of significant initiatives which we undertook from 1986 to 89 to improve our ability to support the POW MIA effort. Now, I assure you, Mr. Chairman, that my comments here are not motivated by any desire for any agency or self-aggrandizement. However, it seems to me that as a result of so much notoriety regarding the negative aspects of this issue, especially as relates to government support, there has been a growing sense out there in the hinterland of America that very little good work has been done to resolve this issue, and that frankly we just don't care. It seems to me that in this climate of mistrust, that it is appropriate on occasion to call attention to those very positive steps that were taken, steps that I continue to be very, very proud of. Now, I believe that it is important that the American people know that there were and are dedicated, tireless, and committed people in the Defense Intelligence Agency who have made, and I'm sure continue to make, magnificent contributions in supporting the POW MIA effort. I believe that they need to know that in view of the constant drumbeat of criticism of the agency from the media and a variety of other sources, including at times some members of this committee, Mr. Chairman, I'm not suggesting that there were not problems in DIA. There were problems, many related to resource and organizational limitations from the late 70s to the early 80s. But while I cannot speak for what transpired before 1985, I can categorically and proudly say we made a sincere effort to identify and scope those problems and to fix them. So, Mr. Chairman, with the committee's indulgence, I'll briefly chronicle those achievements publicly for the American people as I respond to your prepared questions. Question: what interaction did you have with Mr. Ross Perot? My interaction began with my inviting Mr. Perot to join my DIA POW Advisory Board. As I entered the office of director, I wanted a group of talented and respected people from outside DOD to look over my shoulder, to have full access to our files, and to provide me with an objective assessment of how I was doing my job and how I could do my job better. Ross Perot already had a long-standing, recognized, sincere interest in the POW MIA issue, and he was one of my first candidates. Unfortunately, Mr. Perot said his duties precluded him from being a full-time member of the advisory board. He recommended his good friend, Brigadier General Robbie Reisner, for membership, and of course I concurred. However, Ross offered his assistance to me in support of my efforts whenever he had time and whenever he was in Washington. The White House had acknowledged Mr. Perot's efforts in support of the POW MIA issue and commended him for his efforts. In view of his past activities, I made a decision to provide him access and to keep him personally involved for our mutual benefit. Question: what access to POW MIA intelligence was Ross Perot given, and for what period of time? He had full and unrestricted access to all POW MIA reports, regardless of classification, and he had that access for the entire period I was director. What was the purpose of this access? Well, the purpose was multifaceted. First, he needed to observe what we were doing and how we were doing our job if he was going to be helpful. Secondly, I wanted to breathe fresh air into the process to attempt to allay once more the allegations that there continued to be some sort of a sinister cover-up of data. Third, I knew that Ross Perot had a network which provided him directly with information on the issue, and frankly, I wanted to tap that source. Access to the files offered him an opportunity to cross-check information and solicit assistance from our analysts. Fourth, Ross Perot had credibility. He had credibility, particularly among family members who knew that he would objectively and vigorously pursue this issue. With this reservoir of talent and support, and I wanted him on our side. Had Vice President Bush or the NSC authorized Perot's access, soliciting Mr. Perot's support as a member of my advisory board and authorizing him access was my idea. I kept the Vice President apprised of all of our activity, including Mr. Perot's involvement, either through members of the NSC staff or personally. Also, the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Weinberger, was aware and approved. What impact did Mr. Perot's private negotiating forays into Vietnam have on the effectiveness of the U.S. government's efforts to resolve the POW MIA issue with Vietnam? Well, I can't speak for the U.S. government. My charter was to collect, evaluate, and to report. I was not involved with policy matters. Mr. Perot's activities during my tenure had no adverse effect on my mission. What was your involvement with Ross Perot in attempting to obtain a purported videotape of American POWs in 1986? Well, we were both committed to obtaining the tape, whatever it required. I believe now it's necessary to chronicle developments related to the tape in order to understand our respective involvement. On 27 January 86, then Congressman Billy Hendon hand-carried to the White House a letter addressed to the President from Major retired Mark Smith and his attorney, Mr. Mark Walton, in which they revealed the existence of a videotape which allegedly showed 39 American prisoners in captivity in Laos as recent as October of 1985. Mark Smith claimed that he had visited the Mideast and viewed a copy of the tape in the presence of a Mideast intelligence personnel. Now, the next day, on 28 February, Mark Smith, in testimony before the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, talked about the letter to the President, and he promised to gain access to the videotape for the Congressional committee members within 1 week. Now, what followed was a period of frustration, as we never obtained a copy of the tape. I had pledged to Congressman Billy Hendon, who was working with Mark Smith, any support necessary, either personally from me or from my agency, to assist in the acquisition of that tape. We contacted the Mideast Intelligence Service, which Smith had claimed had access to a copy. We were advised that they knew of no such videotape and stated that the meeting described by Smith could not have taken place. Nevertheless, I insisted that we continue to pursue acquisition of the tape aggressively. On 20 February, Congressman Hendon telephoned me at 2300 hours in my quarters and reported that Mark Smith was in Cyprus trying to obtain the videotape and needed some assistance to clear away some obstacles. I responded to his request and provided the support asked. On 28 February, another letter was delivered to the White House stating that Mark Smith had returned from a trip overseas with an offer which would have Congressman Hendon, then Congressman Bob Smith, now Vice Chairman, Mark Smith, and Senator DeConcini to travel to Southeast Asia to view the tape, after which they would be required to pay $4.2 million in cash to take the original of the tape and other evidence. On 3 March, Congressman Hendon, Congressman Bob Smith, Mark Smith, along with Attorney Mark Walton, met with representatives of DIA. The proposal, as outlined in the letter of the President, was presented to DIA by Congressman Hendon and Mark Smith. Hendon and Mark Smith were asked by DIA if they had any further information about the tape, and both replied that they had names associated with the PWs shown in the tape. However, when asked, both Hendon and Mark Smith refused to provide any of the names. I've always been at a loss to understand why Senator Smith was not able to exert sufficient influence on Hendon and Mark Smith to convince them to turn over this potentially vital information to the governmental agency responsible for accounting for PWs. As for my involvement with Mr. Perot in this effort, my recollection is that I discussed this tape with Mr. Perot as related to government policy, a policy which precluded us from paying for information. I also recall Mr. Perot saying that he had talked with Vice President Bush and they had discussed the tape. I recall Mr. Perot informing me that he realized that this could be a scam, but stated he agreed with me that we needed to pursue it. He indicated he would pledge the $4.2 million in a safe way, payable only after full verification of his authenticity. I considered his efforts to be a reflection of his patriotism and sincere concern over the issue, and that still applies. He made no mention of any remuneration nor any offer by the government for any payback. I recall a memo which indicated that the Vice President had telephoned Congressman Hendon to inform him that Ross Perot had been asked to look into the latest reports of POWs in Southeast Asia and asked Mr. Hendon to cooperate with Mr. Perot to determine whether or not recent reporting was valid. Now, I know that Mr. Hendon was in touch with Mr. Perot during this period. I have a recollection of Mr. Perot mentioning the possible allocation of funds for either transportation or to assist in the release of Mr. Obasi, alias Mr. Gregson, who was in a Singapore jail for fraud charges. Now, this was the fellow who allegedly had the film, and as the committee knows, the tape was never made available by Mr. Obasi. What was your role in the organization of the Thai Commission in 1986, and what influence did you have on its conclusions and recommendations? The answer to these questions, Mr. Chairman, are provided in General Thai's own words from the foreword of the Thai report, and I quote directly. General Peroots called me into the DIA for a lengthy discussion of this issue soon after he assumed his position as director of DIA. He was determined to assure a thoroughly professional DIA effort. I agreed to conduct an investigation at General Peroots' request, unquote. Now, I use this direct quote to correct a misconception by some lately that the Thai task force was somehow forced upon me. Again, for emphasis, no one ever approached me to take on General Thai. It was solely and exclusively my idea for good and honorable reasons. I made my case to General Thai, and he graciously accepted the offer. I might add that I took him on despite some trepidation by some outside the intelligence community that he might use this as an opportunity to foster his own views regardless of the evidence. For my part, as can be confirmed by the public record and by my good friend General Thai himself, I never questioned the honesty, integrity, or motives of General Thai and was pleased at his acceptance of my offer. Now, as to what influence I had over its conclusions and recommendations, well, the answer is absolutely none. General Thai and his people, as well as the review board, had total access to all of the files with no strings attached, and the conclusions and recommendations were theirs. Again, I quote from his own words in the report itself to illustrate that I offered absolutely no constraints, and I quote, "The director of DIA further insisted that my investigation go anywhere my findings took it. The charter emphasized that they were to look for any indication of any impropriety or cover-up," end quote. Now, there was some discussion among the task force members over the wording of one important conclusion. The ultimate wording was, and I quote, "DIA holds information that establishes the strong possibility of American prisoners of war being held in Laos and Vietnam." There were discussions over the word possibility versus probability, and the addition of the words of war vice the word simply prisoners. General Thai ultimately agreed on the conclusion as currently written, that is, DIA holds information that establishes the strong possibility of American prisoners of war being held in Laos and in Vietnam. Mr. Chairman, here's where I must publicly take issue with several of my dear friend General Thai's remarks at your recent public hearing. This is difficult for me. First, concerning the dramatic announcement that was prompted by Senator Smith that he believed that his room was bugged and that it was the unanimous conclusion of the task force members. By the way, Mr. Chairman, since Senator Smith knew he was going to follow that line of questioning, it seems to me that it might have been more effective and enlightening if I would have been invited to appear with General Thai during that public hearing. Perhaps that's not appropriate, but the thought occurred to me. Mr. Chairman, I've been personal friends and continue to be personal friends with General Thai for many years. He has consistently been complimentary towards my efforts in supporting the POW-MI issue, and I'm grateful. But I simply cannot let this bugging claim go unchallenged. It is inconceivable to me, as it must be to you, that now, over 5 years later, the first mention of bugging is uttered. I have been in contact with General Tai frequently over the years. He continues to be a member of the DIA Advisory Board at my recommendation. Never did he or any task force member mention that they had even a suspicion of any bugging of their facility. Just 3 weeks ago at Dulles Airport, the next morning after the hearing, I asked General Tai why he had made this charge. He quickly responded that he knew that I had nothing to do with any bugging, and that he was prepared to say that to anyone. I told him that wasn't the point, Gene. The point was that if there ever was even the suspicion that the room was bugged, no matter who bugged it, surely he would have told me, and I firmly believe he would have. It is inappropriate that I hear it over 5 years later in a public hearing. Also, the statement by General Tai that it was a unanimous conclusion of all the task force members that the room was bugged is false. As Mr. Arthur Kloss, a member of the task force, stated 2 days ago on 10 August 1992, quote, "I cannot imagine who would want to bug the room or for what purpose," unquote. Mr. Chairman, I can't imagine who or why that room would have been bugged. I asked for General Tai to do the report. I asked for the review board to support the effort. None of these people are shrinking violets. None of them would hesitate telling me or anyone else their views. There's no need to collect their views via a bug. Mr. Chairman, the thing that adds to this growing lack of confidence that the American people have about our public servants is the way this charge almost appeared to be staged and reacted to. Even the committee's response to the allegation, if you please, seemed to imply acceptance of the charge before sufficient investigation was conducted. Your reaction, as I recall, was something like, "Now things begin to make sense." Senator Grassley stated, and I quote from the transcription, "That is why people do not trust the government and suspicions are created on efforts to resolve the issue," unquote. Senator Smith stated, and I quote, "I was shocked to learn that the task force was being bugged, not allegedly bugged, was being bugged. I intend to ask for the identification of the individual who authorized the bugging of General Tai's office, not the alleged bugging, but the bugging of General Tai's office." All the comments implicitly accept the allegation that there was a bugging. Gentlemen, I do not believe there was. There's no evidence there was. And yet the American people were again left with a picture of a sinister operation by the Defense Intelligence Agency. And this is unfair. I don't have to tell you the responsibility to be fair and objective. And for the most part, you've demonstrated that capacity. I watched you for 8 hours, and I commend you for it. Further, Senator Smith, I'm told in DIA that they're waiting for that investigation that you were going to demand. I'm waiting for it too, because I'm demanding an investigation of that bugging. Other comments made by General Tai at that hearing need to be addressed. Again, Senator Smith prompted General Tai with a question, "Were you denied information?" Surprisingly, his response was, "Yes, I knew I did not have access to all intelligence information." Again, that's simply not true. I directed that all files or any other information that the task force and review board requested or needed be provided. In that regard, it's interesting to note that General Tai called for only 43 case history files for that entire period, files that he was most familiar with. The point is, I repeatedly asked General Tai and the review group if they were getting the support they needed and never received anything but a positive answer. Now, gentlemen, again, I remind you that the people involved are not timid. If there was any problem in getting necessary information, would they not have called attention to it and made it even a matter of record in the report? I'm sure they would have, because these are all men of integrity. Again, I hear of this alleged problem for the first time over 5 years later. I cannot accept that. There were other references by General Tai at the hearing that bothered me. He suggested that he was surprised that I had what he described as my people on board the review group. Let's review the makeup of the review group. General Russ Daugherty, a distinguished aviator and lawyer. General Robert Kinston, distinguished combat veteran and commander, and the first commanding officer of the JCRC. He was also accompanying General Vesey on several trips to Hanoi. Lieutenant General Peter Flynn, distinguished aviator and ex-Vietnam POW. Lyman Kirkpatrick, a giant in the intelligence world. Brigadier General Robbie Reisner, fighter pilot, ex-POW and a close confidant of Ross Perot. Major General Murray, a Vietnam veteran with special knowledge on Vietnam logistics. These distinguished men belong to no one. They're in nobody's pocket. They are patriots with a strong commitment to this issue. 2 of them spent years in North Vietnamese camps. They served with no strings attached, and they knew it. I'm one of the very best people I could find to provide an honest and objective review of our efforts, and to categorize them as my men does a great disservice to them. Final question. Were you satisfied with the attention and resources the POW-MI issue was receiving during your tenure? The answer to that question is yes, because I demanded attention and resources once I identified the problems in the agency. Early in my statement, I mentioned the many significant initiatives we accomplished in 3 short years. Let me briefly elaborate. Early, we concluded a range of investigations designed to identify for me the problem areas. You're familiar with the Gaines report. You're familiar with the Tire report. We raised the national collection priority to priority 1. Never before had that been done. It had been a 5 in the late 70s under Gene Tye and was never above 3. We increased the number of people dedicated to this effort by over 300%. We brought on new fresh blood at both the working and management level. There would be no tired analysts. We automated the entire database for the first time. This greatly facilitated the analysis process. At my request, Mr. Casey, the DCI, authorized for the first time the creation of an intelligence community working group, which I chaired. The purpose of this group was to ensure a unified intelligence effort and to constantly discuss ways to improve collection and analysis by the intelligence community. We used to sit around and say, what can we do better to support this effort? Organizationally, we moved the POW-MIA division in DIA from under a directorate and elevated it to be directly under the command element for my personal scrutiny and support. In response to criticism of debunking and by tired analysts, we established a procedure that required a review board to look at every case to determine the disposition and action. Thereby, no single analyst could ever make that determination again. We implemented an aggressive analytical effort designed to identify the most probable areas of potential activity. All reports were considered valid in this review. My motive for this geographical clustering, I see you have one, was to identify the most likely areas for any on-the-ground human collection effort, even if we had no hard specific evidence. I introduced senior level involvement in the effort across the DIA agency. Virtually all the Defense Intelligence Agency SESs, or senior executive service people, were asked to review and comment on the effort. We created and financed collection teams for increased on-the-ground interviews of refugees and other classified human operations. Now, this capability remains in effect today. It's a significant accomplishment. We implemented an open door policy whereby any family member could talk to me personally any day or any time of the day concerning our efforts or their concerns, and believe me, they exercised this policy frequently. We energized a very special collection effort at NSA to accommodate one of General Tye's chief concerns about our ability to get into a particular area. We instituted an active program of briefing for the Congress to keep them apprised of our efforts. And finally, we gave the POW-MIA effort full budgeting support out of the GDIP, the General Defense Intelligence Program, for any initiative. It was my #1 priority for funding in the agency. Now, there are more. These are all self-imposed initiatives. They're not directed by anybody. They were made as a result of a sensitive, caring agency determined to do its very best to improve our support to this vital issue. From a personal vantage point, few can truly appreciate the sense of commitment and responsibility I felt to this effort. I had to look those family members in the eye and pledge our best effort. One needs to wear the mantle of responsibility to fully understand the impact of that responsibility. I spent hours lying awake at night trying to think of new ways I might improve the effort. I was haunted by the thoughts of some of my comrades in arms possibly being over there, and by their suffering families who deserve every ounce of our energy and our commitment. I still ask myself the question, what more could we possibly have done? But Senators, I can honestly say in retrospect, we gave it one hell of an effort, and I'm so very proud of the men and women of DIA that responded tirelessly to my constant and often relentless demands, and I feel certain that the same responsiveness prevails in the agency today. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, General Peroots. I appreciate that forceful testimony. Let me just serve notice again. I was called on to do this yesterday, and I'm going to do it today. I don't do this, with pleasure, but I'm going to tell you, whoever in this audience chooses to respond in any way, positively or negatively, to any testimony, we will ask you to be removed. The committee is going to do its work in a dignified fashion, and we will not have demonstrations of support or antipathy one way or the other. And the Sergeant-at-Arms is so noticed. Mr. Childress, if you would give your opening statement, please.
Senator Kerry, Senator Smith, distinguished members of the Senate Select Committee on POWs, thank you for this opportunity to appear before you to discuss the efforts of the executive branch from 1981 to 1989 to achieve the fullest possible accounting of American servicemen and civilians who remain unaccounted for as a result of the Vietnam War. I recognize the tremendous responsibility this committee has undertaken on the POWMI issue. Your recommendations and conclusions will be significant, as will unintended consequences on American public opinion and decision-making in Hanoi. The focus of your questions to me concerned the involvement of Mr. Ross Perot. I took the liberty of providing a more omnibus statement to aid you from my perspective when understanding the context of his involvement, as well as attempting to provide you with an overview of where the Reagan-Bush administration began, what we went through, what we accomplished, some impressions on Vietnamese negotiating phases, the live prisoner issue, and comments on the bureaucracy. I have attempted to answer your specific questions as best as I can recall, but the paper record would be the most accurate. I do want to express issue concerns as well. The media has portrayed the committee's work as resolving the issue. Statements have been represented that it is time to get the issue behind us once and for all. I have a sense of deja vu, for I felt the issue could be resolved on my watch as well, and it involved over 7 years of intense negotiating efforts. As you know, current media sentiments ignore Vietnamese knowledgeability and assume the answers are all in Washington. In the end, we're still left with the same hard facts. Vietnam can easily account for hundreds of Americans and have not yet exercised the requisite will to do so. Despite a lot of publicity about Vietnamese cooperation lately from the measure of resolving cases, it is clearly meager. In my larger testimony, I outlined why this is not a new pattern. President Reagan assumed office with a personal commitment to resolving the issue and made public statements concerning it in the 1970s. Under this commitment, the administration was determined to pursue the issue as a matter of highest national priority during his term in office. Frankly, a mess was inherited. No policy-level negotiations were ongoing. Intelligence priorities were at an all-time low. The previous administration had adopted a position endorsed by a House Select Committee and Presidential Commission that there was no credible evidence that anyone remained alive in Southeast Asia, and remains recovery was problematic at best. The JCRC in Bangkok was staffed with 2 personnel and no direct administrative support or even a vehicle. The Central Identification Lab was undermanned. Thousands of refugees had not been and were not being debriefed. The DIA had a small core of dedicated analysts who felt the office was going to be closed completely in the 1970s. The National League of Families had been demonstrating in front of the White House as well as foreign missions, did not trust the government, and although a member of the IAG, they did not consider it effective. Government provided transportation for the families to come to Washington for briefings had been halted in the 1970s. The only organized congressional interest being shown was by the House Subcommittee on Asian Pacific Affairs and the House POWMI Task Force. Private Americans were attempting to organize Rambo-like raids. Live sighting reports were randomly classified, if at all, and there was little general public interest, even among many veterans groups. I could go on, but the challenges were immense. How we tackled and met the above challenges is in my testimony. The committee asked several questions concerning Mr. Ross Perot, and the larger testimony was provided so the committee could better put his involvement in the overall context of the issue and our negotiations. I had contact with Mr. Perot briefly on 3 occasions, 2 phone conversations, one in 1984, another in, I believe, 1985, and an almost 2-hour briefing with Mr. Perot in the Pentagon. I believe I was called over by General Schufelt at DIA at the time. Mr. Perot wanted to talk to me about our policy and strategy. I have no firsthand knowledge of precisely how long Mr. Perot had access to POWMI intelligence or what access. General Perutz, I think, has answered that question. I understood from DIA that Mr. Perot was invited to participate as a member of the Thai Review Group, but declined and nominated, or accepted, then declined and nominated Brigadier General Reisner to take his place. The policy community was generally proud of the progress we had made up to this point in comparison to 1981, when we believed Mr. Perot had left the issue. There was a general feeling that given his public posture, providing Mr. Perot access to see how far we had progressed would be positive in building greater public support for the priority. I have no first-hand knowledge of any direct taskings to Mr. Perot by the President or the Vice President. It's my clear impression, however, that Mr. Perot was discouraged from going to Vietnam in the spring of 1987, and that if he insisted on going, it was to be as a private citizen, since we had already selected General Vesey months prior as the President's emissary to Hanoi. General Vesey had accepted the mission and was already in the research phase prior to his projected travel. Upon Mr. Perot's return from Vietnam, as I recall, he was debriefed in early April concerning his trip. He also asked to meet with the President, which was scheduled, I believe, in May. I was tasked to prepare the meeting documents for the President from the National Security Advisor, which included suggested talking points. As I understand the purpose of the meeting, it was to allow Mr. Perot to directly brief the President on his trip to Hanoi. I did not attend this meeting. I did see his written report after the meeting. I was told that in addition to receiving Mr. Perot's briefing, it was emphasized again that General Vesey was our emissary to Hanoi. It is my opinion, in response to your question, that Mr. Perot's trip was counterproductive to U.S. efforts. The Vietnamese at the time had not been informed an emissary had been appointed by the President, as that was to be the task of the advanced delegation after assurance that Hanoi was prepared to receive General Vesey on a humanitarian basis. The Vietnamese were undoubtedly aware of Mr. Perot's public posture in the press and his access. Thus, his trip could have been interpreted as official. More importantly, he reportedly told the Vietnamese of General Vesey's appointment and held broad-ranging discussions on Vietnamese economic and political goals, which implied direct linkage. In addition, when he returned, derisive press reports about the Department of State and previous U.S. negotiating team members were published. Confusion reigned for a while. We answered questions in White House and state press conferences to clarify Mr. Perot's private status. We also had to answer Vietnamese concerns who appeared confused as well. In my written testimony, I described the hostile reception accorded to Vesey advance delegation after Mr. Perot's trip. Concerning the question of resources and attention, as evident in my testimony, few resources and less attention were being brought to bear on the issue when the Reagan-Bush administration assumed office. We went from ground zero to a national priority program in less than 3 years. It was gratifying to me during this period that I had complete and total support from both President Reagan and Vice President Bush. They were personally interested, committed, and supportive. In addition, each of the national security advisors provided encouragement, resources, and commitment to the issue. Due to the functional nature of the POWMI issue, it cut across departmental and agency lines. The Secretaries of State and Defense were all behind the effort and supported the upgrades in personnel, intelligence priorities, public awareness, outreach to families, and diplomatic initiatives. Importantly, on the IAG, where policy initiatives were hammered out, we had staunch advocates on the issue. It was a coherent team that could disagree, coordinate.
Let me just ask if I can, Mr. Childress. I noticed that you have a long statement, and I think you're going line for line at this point. Is this a summary?
No, this is, I've got about that much left.
Wow, that's terrific. Okay, no, I just was...
I was not going to do 13 single-space pages for...
Long statements for senators around here.
No. Importantly, on the IAG, where policy initiatives were hammered out, we had staunch advocates of the issue. It was a coherent team that could disagree, coordinate, and re-agree without rancor because we had the same objective. In the middle of all of us was Ann Mills Griffiths, prodding, suggesting, criticizing, and pitching in to help. In terms of resources, we've more than tripled manpower during this period. Budget money not budgeted was found by the departments for all the initiatives. We were able to pursue the issue without compromising other national objectives. Additional resources were contemplated or planned depending on Vietnamese agreements. The results of our efforts brought final answers to approximately 175 families. We negotiated the return of a private American who many believed was dead and made the POW issue one of priority. This is a legacy in which we feel pride. I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Childress. Mr. Ambassador.
I'll take a signal from you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I mentioned to you in February in Moscow when I met you and Senator Smith that I would appreciate the opportunity to testify. You've afforded it. I think the questions and answers are probably where you want to go, and so do I, so I'll rest with that. Thank you.
Well, we appreciate that. Thank you very much. As I was listening to your testimony, General Peroots, about the mysterious bug, I was reminded that this is the room of the famous potted plant, and I hope that we're not going to get diverted into a sort of bug session here. I want to try to keep it on focus. But I do appreciate your strong rebuttal of that prior testimony, which has not really sidetracked the committee, I think, too much. I would like to begin my questioning today maybe a little differently from the last couple of days, not narrowly focused, but broadly focused, if I may, for a minute. First of all, though, I'd like to pick up something with you, Mr. Childress. You said the Perot trip is counterproductive, correct? It was deemed counterproductive by the Reagan administration, was it not?
I can't speak for the entire administration. From my perspective...
Well, in effect, the president called him in and said, thank you very much, we don't need you anymore.
I wasn't at that meeting. The president...
But that meeting you know took place.
The meeting took place to receive his report, and it was emphasized... So
the bottom line was they felt that it was thank you very much, we don't need you. Is that correct?
I think that's a fair interpretation, yes.
So it was deemed non-productive. Counterproductive, even.
Counterproductive.
But in point of fact, the memo that we have from Mr. Cannon to Baker says very specifically that for whatever reason, the NSC staffers cannot get into Hanoi to talk to Nguyen Tak in order to get Vesey approved. It was Perot who went there who got Vesey approved. That's not exactly counterproductive.
That is not, if I could explain. Mr. Perot became involved at a time after the Vietnamese had halted cooperation on the 2-year plan. I had returned from New York, meeting with the Vice Minister, Zhang, and determined that we could no longer go forward in the mode we were in. We had to have another initiative. We coordinated with the IAG, and in October of '86 determined that and the President approved the concept of a presidential emissary. General Vesey in January was selected and accepted the mission. When we finished that portion of it, then we're putting in a request for the Vietnamese to accept an advance delegation to set the agenda. It wasn't a matter of the Vietnamese refusing to accept Vesey or anything else. It was a matter of us going to the Vietnamese saying we want to put an advance delegation in and talk to you about a new initiative. We were waiting Vietnamese reply. I had gone to New York and talked to them as well. Now, there was a lot of confusion, and it's obviously reflected in these memos. In the NSC structure, we were waiting for a Vietnamese response, not thinking we were being stiff so much as that they were getting ready to have elections and the rest, and
fair enough. Delays. But let me just ask you, bottom line is, I mean, this is pretty simple stuff, and we don't need to belabor it. Ross Perot did get the Vietnamese to be enthusiastic about the idea and to accept it. It was correct?
No, sir. When I took the advanced delegation in, they were hostile to the concept. They said they saw nothing new in it. It was a laborious 2 days with the Vietnamese. They finally said they would consider it. And I went after Mr. Perot.
Okay. So you're suggesting that his version is incorrect, that he did not, in fact, grease the skids, so to speak?
I did not see evidence of it when I arrived in Hanoi.
Now let me ask you, each of you. You have been in high positions of responsibility, all of you. You've had a role in this POW MIA issue. We are here 20 years after the fact, in some cases of some missing people longer than that. Some Americans say, what is this all about? Is this a fool's mission that this committee is on and that people are on? Are we here for a reason that is understandable and explainable to the American people? Mr. Peroots?
I think so.
Mr. Childress?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Armitage?
Absolutely.
It is true, is it not, that 20 years later, we do not have a full accounting of our missing. Is that not true, Mr. Peroots?
That's true statement.
Mr. Childress?
True.
So if it is true that we did not have a full accounting as we sit here today in 1992, it has to be equally as true that we did not have a full accounting in 1973 when we left Vietnam. Is that true, Mr. Peroots?
True statement.
True. True.
So it is also possible, if we did not have a full accounting, let me approach that differently. Each of you has said we did not have a full accounting in 1973. That is the same testimony we've had from other people, which is why we're here. General Vesey has presented our government and the Vietnamese with 135 cases, which are major question marks. Accurate?
That's correct.
We have uncovered a similar amount going at it through our own lists. We're all in the same vicinity. And DIA had some 269 cases, correct?
That's correct.
So in point of fact, this issue that has haunted America for 20 years has not haunted it falsely.
Correct.
It is because we did not have the answers in 1973.
That's correct.
Now, we also have evidence that people were last known to be alive or to be in captivity in 1973. You know that to be a fact, General Perutz, from your role at DIA, do you not?
I'm amazed at how much more information has come to the front as a result of your efforts, yeah.
Mr. Childress?
We knew certainly of last known alive cases or in proximity to Vietnamese forces that could have been captured. Precisely the date 1973, but certainly at that period.
Mr. Armitage?
Personal matter, this was my assumption from 73 to 81 when I assumed office.
And you, Mr. Childress, even believed when you were in the NSC in 1985 that people might still be alive and held in captivity, did you not?
I believe firmly in the policy. We ought to presume they're there. Personal beliefs can go either way on it. I went up and down on this issue. I'd get a report that would excite me, and we'd follow it up, and then I would drop again. But in a generic sense, I absolutely believe that somebody had to have survived.
Now, that's very important because a lot of people in this country have been willing to shove people off into a corner and suggest that their patriotism and their devotion to this issue was somehow kooky or right-wingish or reflective of a kind of zealotry that was without foundation. And each of you is here to say you don't accept that.
No, I think each of us is here to say more than that, Senator. I think, speaking for the three here, each of us in pursuing this issue has suffered attacks on our family, certainly personal attacks, which are nothing new to government, attacks on our property, harassments at our office, etc. And I don't think we'd put up with it unless we believed that there was the possibility of getting an American alive out.
Well, then tell me why it is. I mean, the committee is trying to sort all of this out. Why is it that there is such a strong feeling of a conspiracy, such a sense people have that information hasn't been forthcoming? Now, there are plenty of reasons I can give you because I don't think it has been forthcoming, because I don't think the response has been terrific, notwithstanding the changes that were made. And I think it's good to have on the record the Thai report came from you, came voluntarily, you wanted to do better, but that was 1985 already. This issue was on the burner in 1973. What happened, gentlemen? What happened?
Ironic that the period when there should have been even more of a full court press, there was less of an effort.
Can you say that again a little more clearly?
At a period when the trail was hotter, when there should have been more of a very extensive, aggressive, what I call full court press on it, there was less effort.
Why?
Well, you've deliberated that in this committee, and there are a variety of reasons.
Let me try, if I may, Mr. Chairman. I don't have the answer. I've got, it's like a belly button, an opinion. Everyone's got one. But part of the reason there was so much distrust was because during the 73 to 81 period, you'd had commissions that had written off the issue. You'd had attempts to normalize Vietnam, at least an embryonic one, without resolving the issue. Speaking for the first Reagan administration, we very deliberately went on a very high-profile mission of publicizing this issue, fact books and speeches, etc., with a deliberate, there's your plot. And the plot was because we didn't know who was going to win the election in 1984. And we wanted to be assured that the issue outlasted whatever administration existed at the time, and that it would have to be resolved. And I think in that very public awareness rising, we also engendered the seeds of great frustration because we got everybody up, and then we were not able to bring out a live American other than, of course, Rob Schwab, whom you all know about.
Well, is it possible that the committee has the evidence, obviously, of this critical moment in time in 1973 when, with the return of the prisoners, President Nixon makes the statement, all the prisoners are coming home. There's some discussion within the Defense Department about whether they are, in fact, all home, but this dramatic statement is made that there's no indication anyone's alive. And as you said, it's kind of written off. I mean, is that accurate?
Yeah, but I think it's also accurate to say it was written up in a number of ways. A statement by the administration, statement by subsequent commissions who looked at the issue.
Agreed. Everybody. Now, therefore, this notion of conspiracy, while there's no overt conspiracy conceivably, there is legitimacy, is there not, in the perception that there's at least a conspiracy of silence?
Senator, the way the
for
war,
a period of time.
The way the war ended, the discrepancy cases, the kinds of things you're looking into, we made in public speeches in the 80s. I spoke to the League of Families and talked about it. I mean, it's that part of it, it's not new. What I'm seeing for the first time is that the administration at the end in 73 felt strongly enough of the possibility that they were going to contemplate a massive diplomatic or military threat to try to achieve something. But I think we've got to remember, too, that in 1973, millions of Americans were on the streets demonstrating to get out. This, you know, if there's guilt, if there's sins of our fathers somewhere, I certainly think that paintbrush is very wide, and it's in the American psyche more than just...
I don't disagree with that, and on every occasion this has come up, I've tried to be, you know, absolutely non-accusatory, and I want to emphasize that. The committee is not here, the committee's here trying to find out what happened, so we can explain this issue, understand it. And there isn't any question but that the national psyche at the time, which I, believe me, understand full well because I was in the middle of it, I know where everybody was then. There were a lot of currents. But we need to understand reality here. You know, there are books coming out that suggest this is myth. Well, clearly, if you've got 133 people, some of whom you believed were alive, and they don't come back, you're not dealing with myth. And that's what's kept us alive for 20 years, is the fact that it isn't myth. On the other hand, I don't think it's unfair to say that some did raise this thing to a crescendo in politics without applying resources and negotiating posture and commitment to resolve it. So in 1992, we're trying to do that. Now, my time is up. I would like to hear each of you tell us how Americans can put this issue to rest in 1992. What has to happen between the Vietnam and Laos and ourselves to not go around in a terrible catch-22 of circular pointing the finger and blaming each other? Can it be put to rest? My last question.
Well, I think there's a preparatory remark that has to be made. The next time we should win a war. When you win, you don't have these questions. And I think that's not a frivolous statement on my part. In order to put this behind us, I don't want to take exception with what you're describing as discrepancy cases, 133 or 135 people, but I know from my own look at this issue when I was active in it that it is a mistake to automatically write off the possibility of people who aren't discrepancies being alive. And we had a case when I was a DASD at the Pentagon of a KIA BNR coming back. So I think you've got to be very careful just concentrating on discrepancy cases. Clearly, the Vietnamese have to, by word and action...
Just say, for those who don't understand, a KIA BNR is a killed in action body not recovered status. And in one case at the end of the war, someone who had been listed as killed in action, body not recovered, came back in the course of Operation Homecoming, not listed as a prisoner, but rather killed in action.
Just to sum up clearly, the government of Vietnam, Laos, and what passes for a government in Cambodia have to open up and give full and complete access to Americans upon request, with no waiting periods, etc., before we can begin to put it at rest.
Well, you heard what I said. Excuse me, I'm sorry to go longer, but yesterday Ross Perot said that's a waste of time. I mean, you can go into a prison if you give it an hour's notice, and if anybody were there, they're going to move something. I mean, basically, he said what the Vietnamese have been saying, which is this is silly.
Look, we got when I was active, 1,500 live sighting reports. It seems to me if Americans are running around at quite a high level that you're going to get reports, you're going to get information, and Mr. Perot may be correct that they can hide you once or fool you twice, but they can't fool you over the long time. When they move people, they expose themselves. You're going to catch them.
Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the three witnesses up at the same time and so many questions, it's very hard to focus. I did have one question, and it just basically yes or no, if you wish, while you were actively engaged in the issue in your relative positions, were any of you aware of the Eagleburger Memorandum? And
I was not. I was not.
I was not.
It's just interesting, the compartmentalization of these documents. I think one thing that's been very positive of, and that was not meant to be a slam at you. I mean,
well, Senator, if I could add, I did do research into the past. I didn't come across this document, but you know, WASAG minutes and things like that. Before I went to Hanoi, I wanted to know if I could find out what kind of terminologies we had used with the Vietnamese before, so that I would either not make the same mistakes if they were made or to have a strategy. Now, in those documents, what I essentially saw was what the Eagleburger memo says, that there was a big question
that there were POWs
in Laos, and discrepancy still existed in Vietnam. I did not see in any of that research that we knew the place, the time, and who, and something that could be actionable.
That's right. I mean, those minutes do indicate references to POWs in Laos, and which has been the whole issue has been the subject of the hearings for ever since we've started, really, but certainly in the last couple of days, as to what happened in that window of time that would change an official policy statement when the intelligence seemed to indicate otherwise, even though those in the intelligence community don't seem to recall anything that we asked them. Let me just kind of shotgun a little bit. There were some statements made. I just want to go back to a few of them. General Peroots referenced the meeting, and I don't recall whose office. Was it Hendon's office? I can't recall. Some congressman's office on the Hill, but regarding Mark Smith and yourself, and I don't know if some of your staff were there. I believe Hendon was there, I was there, and I don't recall who else was there. But in that, it probably doesn't matter, but in that meeting, there was a reference made to a list, and I've checked my notes on that as well, and my notes indicate that the list we were talking about had nothing to do with the tape, and it might be just an unfair, it might be just a memory lapse, but that it referred, we were talking also about Garwood in that meeting, and that there was a list of names associated with Garwood. That's what my memory says, had nothing to do with the tape, but that's maybe an honest difference. But I just wanted to point that out. All of the information that I had relative to that was provided to you at that meeting. Can you help me in regard to that tape incident? As you know, you recall very vividly, as I'm sure I do, Mark Smith with tears in his eyes expressing in great detail what he claimed to have seen on that tape. It was a pretty emotional meeting. This guy was pretty well decorated and a POW, and he said he saw the tape. He described it in graphic detail, about which we don't need to go into. But do you, I mean, I found myself I suppose we all wanted to believe him, but we also found ourselves, he was very persuasive, let's put it that way. Would you characterize that the same way?
I didn't attend the meeting that Jim Shufelt did, but his reaction.
Well, you were at I remember you at one meeting. It may have been,
there were two.
May have been another one, but.
No,
you were at the meeting with Mark Smith.
Yes.
Yeah.
I came away with the view that there's a tape, and that we need to get that tape, and we pressed hard to get that tape.
And is it your testimony that that the Vice President also, at that time, Vice President Bush, was also very anxious to secure that tape?
Yes, sir.
Do you have any indication from your own information as to why why we didn't get it?
Senator, you know, we still haven't closed the book on that. There's a misconception that in pursuing that tape that me or DIA was the focal point. I would have loved to have been, as you recall. We ran that thing as all over the world in attempting to acquire it, but we were on the periphery. Most of the efforts for acquisition, as you know, was done by Mark and Billy Hendon, supported by Ross Perot. I volunteered all the help I could. I recall I said, I'll give you an airplane, I'll go on the airplane. So I was trailing, seeing how I could help. And so when we got beyond the Cyprus and into Singapore, the final chapter of that is still vague. Was it destroyed on the West Coast? There was a report that Gregson ultimately said there's a mistake. What they really want is support for the rebels. There's a report that as a result of Obasi or Gregson coming, I think, to North Carolina, somebody that Murkowski blew the whistle and jeopardized the thing, and so he destroyed the tape. We heard from Ross saying that he got a call saying that they tried to arrest him, and I don't have any knowledge of that.
Sure. Go ahead.
Let me just ask you prompt a question there. I'm having a hard time understanding why, if somebody has in their possession a tape of American prisoners which has been promised to be paid $4.2 million for it, they would destroy it. I mean, it either has value, and if people have it away from whoever the holders of the people are, as they did, there is no purpose in destroying it. There's no reason to just let this tape vanish.
You're absolutely correct.
Well, I think there's great debate, and we'll probably never know whether the tape existed or not, but the reason why I think the real issue here is that we did have an individual who claimed to have seen it, not other than Gregson, Mark Smith. Now, he said he saw it, he described what he saw in it, and I think that's what motivated the action by you, properly so, and the Vice President, Mr. Perot, and everybody else and some of us in the Congress who offered our services in any way we could to get it. But it didn't happen. To the best of your knowledge, the United States government never got the tape, correct?
I know that we haven't. Let me just qualify.
I want to move to another subject, but go ahead.
Okay, no, just my view on that. You were absolutely correct in describing our reaction to the first description of that tape in Mark Smith's. We all thought. My confidence level went down rapidly after that for some of the reasons that Senator Kerry mentioned. When we traced the allegation that in the Middle East that he had one of the 3 copies of the tape and that had been seen there, and we had specific information from Mark Smith on the office and who was, they denied it and said, and then from then on it went downhill, and it looked more and more like a scam when Obasi was in jail for fraud. I mean,
let me just shotgun over to another subject. I don't want to dwell on it, as Senator Kerry said. I don't think we should. There are other things that are, but I do want to comment on just challenge you on one point, because you brought my name into it. I didn't prompt General Ty on the issue of bugging. It was brought to my attention by a member of the committee who alleged that the meeting was bugged. I asked General Ty the question, had no idea what he was going to say. Frankly, I was surprised at what he said. He said it was. a bug. Now, he also said that that was the unanimous conclusion of the, or words to that effect, of the group. Now, I would just say to you that what I have been told by more than one member of that committee was that the Air Force security personnel came into the room and removed a device, an electronic device, from a telephone. Now, nobody ever said you ordered a bug or your office ordered a bug. I just said I would like to know, and we are conducting an investigation. DIA is now conducting an investigation, which we're trying to follow on that. That's all. That's, okay. I just want to make that.
Perhaps a poor choice of words. I didn't mean to imply that your question prompted it. And by the way, I saw the preliminary results of that investigation, and there's a good answer for that piece of equipment in there, and you'll find that really there's no basis in fact to presume that there was a bug.
Well, it's interesting. You saw the preliminary results, and we haven't. But
just happened.
I'd like to see the preliminary results.
It's ongoing.
Myself. Maybe you could share it with us after the hearing. Mr. Childress, you were, I guess, to put it mildly, not happy with the tire report. Is that correct? Fair characterization.
I saw the first draft, which was full of a lot of policy things, and yeah, that's fair. The first draft I was not happy with.
What was the main reason you weren't happy with it?
Well, I was, first of all, it was supposed to be an intelligence document. It was and General Peroots saw that it was full of policy speculations and so forth, which were musings. They had done this without even talking to people that were in fact conducting negotiations and dealing with the Vietnamese. I also felt that a lot of the conclusions or the statements appeared to be assertions that you couldn't base on only looking at 43 reports, the ones he picked. Now, we went back through those reports, the IAG, we sat down there for hours after the thing was finished, and I still didn't see it. I wanted him to concentrate on discrepancy cases. You know, I think the best case can be made on discrepancy cases, last known alive, and see if intelligence can build from there. But it looked like a shotgun and then assertions, and it just didn't appear professional to me.
You know, my time is up, and let me just one final point. You say, I won't read the whole memo. There's some strong language in there about individuals. I don't mean to bring that out and won't. But on June 18th, in 86, in your memo to General Perutz, you said that the report would destroy the strategy. That's what you said. I mean, the Perutz, General Perutz ordered the tie report based on some internal criticisms. It was followed by the Gaines and then the Brooks. There were all kinds of internal reviews about how the agency was conducting itself. We know that. That's all a matter of public record. But what strategy were you referring to, if you could
I'd have to see it in context. I assume I was talking about since they were doing so much in negotiations and so much in speculation on Vietnamese motives and how to get them to respond, that, and I'm speculating until I see it in perspective, but I think that's what I was referring to, that we had a strategy to gain admissions from Vietnam if we could, and some of the things in there, if adopted or came out, would in fact affect the strategy in the wrong way. It wasn't intelligence, it was...
You made it public. You wrote I don't know, maybe I do have it. Yes, I do have it. You wrote an article, penned an article in the American Legion magazine around that time saying that the Vietnamese pledged to resolve this issue within 2 years is the first written agreement since the end of the war.
Right.
And Ms. Griffiths, I think, has stated publicly during that time that there was not a written agreement, or certainly not a signed one.
Now, the confusion may be this. We entered into discussions with the Vietnamese on a 2-year plan. They agreed conceptually they would, in fact, try to do this. I went to Hanoi after several trips, and right on camera, Zhang sat there and signed the 2-year plan, their plan, handed it to me. there were toasts around, and he hugged me and told the press, "Mr. Childress speaks for the Vietnamese." Now, that was the Vietnamese written plan. We wanted a joint plan. We took it back. They had some political elements in that we couldn't use. They were not putting in discrepancy cases, other things. So what we tried to do is take their written signed plan, merge it with ours, and have a comprehensive joint plan. So the references to a signed agreement is talking about what the Vietnamese signed and gave to us. As it turned out, the Vietnamese politicized the effort, and we never got a joint signed plan. And that's probably what Mrs. Griffiths is referring to.
So it was written but not signed? Is that what you're...
No, they wrote it and signed it.
Well, did we sign it?
We had our input to do the joint plan, and the agreement broke down on a joint plan. But we had a signed plan from the Vietnamese. I'm sure it's in the file. But it did not cover discrepancies and other things we wanted.
Thank you.
Yeah. As I introduced Senator Bob Kerry, I meant to do this earlier, and I just want to call attention to the fact that Senator McCain's mother, Mrs. McCain, is here sitting in the front row, and we're delighted to welcome you here and have you present with us. Senator Bob Kerry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me say that I think the chairman has done a superior job keeping the committee as well as the witnesses focused on the objective of trying, on the one hand, to discover what went wrong and get full access to information, and as well as trying to proceed to the conclusion of what we need to do to get this final and full accounting. And I would say again, for emphasis, one of the problems we're up against is we're dealing with a communist government that lies to its own people and us. I think you have to assume that as a baseline. It makes it difficult to get a full accounting. Mr. Perot yesterday identified one of the paradoxes in this whole matter. If you're trying to negotiate, if you need to negotiate in order to get a full accounting, it's difficult to proceed without some sort of change in our policy, and yet if we change our policy, we find ourselves conceding and so on and so forth. I'd also say that I think it is important to accept Mr. Perot's standard of saying let's not scapegoat. Let's not look back and try to find out who was wrong, who made the mistake. Let's not try to yield to the temptation. Let's try to avoid yielding to the temptation of falling into conspiracy theories. I've got to say in that regard, with full respect for Mr. Perot's efforts to get to the bottom of this and his long-standing commitment to trying to bring our men home, that he himself yesterday on many occasions fell victim to that tendency of taking, in many cases, hearsay statements and saying, well, I heard somebody say that the refugees have orders not to say anything about POWs. That simply isn't true. And in response to questioning by Senator McCain, it was some DEA agent, perhaps I can get the name for you. I mean, I think it's very important for the American people to understand that there is an easy tendency, and you must avoid it, to yield to follow these so-called conspiracy theories. And I think it's very important for us to resist it because we do indeed need to get to the bottom of this. If the possibility is there, and we assume it is, that there could be one single American over there being held as a prisoner, there's an urgency for us to try to keep focused on the objective. I would like to ask the three of you as a first question as to whether or not you think it was a mistake to classify so extensively the information that we had at hand about what was going on. It seems to me that an awful lot of clearing has occurred in the last couple of weeks since the information has been released, since we declassified, and I'd like to know, again, no conspiracy, no finger pointing. In retrospect, with full information now being available to us, do you think it was a mistake to classify so aggressively?
Yes, it seems to me that the Vietnam War, which rent the nation, and this issue is right hand in glove with it. This is also renting the nation, and we would have been better served to declassify. We made a mistake, and the mistake was, I believe, that we made the documents, et cetera, available in closed session to members of Congress, but it just wasn't being bought by the American public, so that's my view. We were too cautious.
I'm assuming we're talking about during the Reagan administration. In 1981, what we found were that some documents were classified, some were not. They were randomly distributed. We felt that to do a serious effort, if we're serious about it, especially the live prisoner issue, that if you got a first-hand live sighting report it should be classified secret until follow-up. So we, in fact, put in classifications and disciplined it, not to hide things, but to treat the issue seriously. We also, in '82, determined and made it policy that the families need to have access. So any report that pertains or may pertain to their particular case, we would, in fact, release it to the family and redact sources and methods. But when we started, stuff was just floating everywhere. And so the classification was a signal of seriousness to us at the time. As events have gone on, you know, publicly, people are saying, well, you're hiding something. Well, we thought we were doing what was correct at the time.
My own view, after 35 years in the business, we have a great tendency to overclassify. And in this area, we have done it incessantly. We, in the signals intelligence arena, I agree with Mr. Perot in that regard. It's archaic. We're still bound by the old directives that had a different meaning for a different purpose. Good percentage of the reports that are in our files in DIA can be and should be declassified, and even the very sensitive ones can be sanitized. That is not in any way a word that suggests leaving out anything that's significant, but where it is that one or two very rare occasion where sources and methods might be involved, or there's a sensitivity, sanitize that in terms of cutting out that and get the report out.
Given that there's a limited amount of time here, my first round of questioning, what I'd like to next focus on is, you know, where do we go from here? One of the things that Mr. Perot suggested yesterday that I think does have some validity to it is the notion that perhaps our chief negotiator, Mr. Vesey's status should be upgraded, that he's essentially out there operating in some ways independent of other policymakers. The question occurs as to whether or not our principal negotiator should be someone with undersecretary status or with higher policymaking status than we currently have, and whether or not, in fact, you can do that given the current nature of our diplomatic relations with Vietnam.
I think General Vesey clearly has the access and status as a special emissary from the President. I would defer, obviously, to his views of whether something else would be more effective. It's my impression that he's been effective and that it's working. Because Vietnam's intransigent at times, or we can't get admissions or so forth, it's less a reflection on the negotiator than the people you're trying to negotiate with.
My view is it's less important, the level of the negotiator, than the fact that he brings a unified message. And that's my personal view. To raise the level is always a fair thing to do. It would please, I'm sure, the Vietnamese, whether it would change any of the behavior and get them to open up their vaults of information, I can't say. But the more important thing in the level of that envoy is the unified message that he would bring. Because it is my experience that if you give the Vietnamese a hole or a crevice, they're going to widen it.
Understand that when we were discussing this with Mr. Perot yesterday, that the idea is you have Secretary Solomon at that time, now he's in the Philippines, but at the time had broad authority for the region, and under questioning from the chairman, Mr. Perot suggested, well, perhaps you needed to have somebody of that kind of stature rather than somebody who's just a special representative of the President. The President has lots of special representatives, and unless you've got that kind of authority, it's difficult sometimes to negotiate, and yet it could not be Secretary Solomon. Because if it's Secretary Solomon, then we are consenting to recognize prior to the completion of the negotiation.
Senator, through from 81 to 89, if you look at the chronology, Assistant Secretary Wolfowitz went, Assistant Secretary Armitage, the Undersecretary had met with the Laos. The flexibility of being able to use a Solomon at the right times or someone in state, I think has been reflected in the way they do it. But you need someone, I think, full-time with the status, and I don't think an assistant secretary could devote, obviously, full time to it, even without the recognition problem.
What do you think of Mr. Perot's statement that we should send somebody over and tell them not to come home until they get the prisoners?
Send somebody else over, will you? Not me. I think he's going to be there for a while.
If it had been that
I think
easy,
you
I'd
need
have
time to
stayed.
back away and reevaluate what you need and what you know from intelligence, et cetera. I'm not sure it's a good idea to set up a permanent bureaucracy there in the absence of normalized relations.
I think he's firing for effect, and I think the spirit of his remark probably is on track. I, for one, believe that, especially in the wake of this committee, that there is an opportunity and you have a responsibility to address not only take those actions which will send the proper message to the Vietnamese and Laotians, but also to the people of this country. So any bold step that is different ought to be tried. If it's cosmetics and it makes sense, try it. To include some sponsorship maybe by the Vice President as he goes over quarterly and waves the flag. I think it's time for some bold efforts to send the proper message to the people out here who are still wondering whether we're doing enough, as well as the people in Southeast Asia.
One last thing, Mr. Chairman. I, for one, would like to follow this statement, General Perutz, that you made about the possibility that on the 3rd March meeting that representation was made by anyone that they had personnel and names attached to that video, but were unwilling to supply those names. I mean, I'd like to, if that's a misunderstanding, terrific, we can lay it to rest. But if in fact did occur that someone said, I've got the names of the people that are on that videotape, but were unwilling to supply those names, I'd like to know that in fact.
We'll provide you the evidence for that. We have a memo, and I think I can refresh Senators. He'll recall that meeting probably. He never said that he had...
A contemporaneous memo was made of that?
I'm sorry, sir.
Contemporaneous memo was made of that meeting?
There was an internal memo which described the meeting, who said what.
Made at the same time, at the end of the meeting?
Yes.
Is that memo available?
I'm sure it is.
What did it say?
It simply said what I told you in my text, that there was a meeting that Mark Smith, retired Major Mark Smith, not Senator Smith, and Mr. Wapple, I believe. No, Mr. Hendon, excuse me, Congressman Billy Hendon then now, commented that they had the names of the U.S. PWs that were on that tape.
There's no doubt in your mind.
No doubt.
And they wouldn't provide the names?
It was a question of trust, I think, at that point.
Who had the names and didn't provide them?
Hendon and Smith claimed that they had the name, Senator.
And that's recorded in the memo?
Yes.
Could you
I was involved with that every step of the way, and that's certainly news to me.
Don't you remember that?
Certainly news to me.
We'll provide
I'd like to see your memo.
the names of the people who were there. And
Senator McCain.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to just follow up a little bit on Senator Kerry's remarks, which I think were very much on the mark. The media reports today on Mr. Perot's hearing, all basically, and I watched a lot of the visual media last night, U.S. officials covered up the truth, dissembled, most of them, I think you've seen, all of you probably seen those media reports. I didn't get that from Mr. Perot's testimony to start with, but General Perutz, how long were you involved in the intelligence business?
in the intelligence business, sir, my entire career, 34 years.
With your background in intelligence, if there was a cover-up, a conspiracy, if there was one, how many active duty members of the military and civilians would have to have been involved in that cover-up, roughly?
Incalculable, it's impossible.
Would it be, say, 10 people?
Depend upon the magnitude of what cover-up you're talking about. If you're talking about a cover-up of a report, it's one thing, but if you're talking about a calculated, sinister cover-up of a dimension that you're, I think, referring to, you're talking about
thousands?
Hundreds, thousands maybe. Oh, yeah, special forces,
Commanders, in order for a cover-up to be successful, as has been alleged, it would have taken the active participation of hundreds, if not thousands, of military personnel. Mr. Armitage, Ambassador Armitage, I want to bring up something with you which is not very pleasant, but I think important, because a record, an official record, must be established on your involvement in this issue. And maybe nobody will believe it now, Ambassador Armitage, but maybe someday historians will. What was your involvement in the Vietnam War, for the record?
I served as a volunteer on a destroyer off the gun line for one tour, and then as a volunteer in 3 subsequent in-country tours as an advisor to the Riverine Forces. So I resigned from the Navy in 1973 and took a position with the Defense Attaché Office in Saigon, where I was responsible for Navy and Marine Corps operations matters.
And you left Saigon in 1975?
I left at the fall of Saigon, Senator.
So your involvement in the Vietnam War was extensive and at significant risk to yourself personally?
Yes.
And Colin Powell, I do not believe that General Powell would mind me paraphrasing. He said he would trust you with his life and his family, I believe, or trust his family too. Is that roughly?
That's the nicest thing I've ever heard. Yes, he said that.
And yet you were accused of being involved in running drugs? Is that correct?
That is true, by the Christic Institute.
You were accused of part of a massive conspiracy to cover up the POW-MIA issue. Is that true?
By many, yes, sir.
Your home has been damaged. Is that correct?
My mailbox. My children have been damaged by threats on the phone, specific, physical and sexual in nature.
And this went on for a period of years while you were involved in a position of responsibility concerning the POW-MIA issue.
That's correct.
Has these allegations ceased?
They have ceased as far as I know. They come from time to time back publicly, but I was able to win a public suit against a woman who wrote a book and reprinted these allegations. And once I was able to win that as a public figure, and you know the standards for defamation of a public figure are quite extraordinary, the allegations recited, but recently they surfaced again with the candidacy of Mr. Perot, but again they've gone away with his removal from the race.
Well, I won't ask you to chronicle the other allegations that have been made against you and your character. I do think that there is substantial, at least circumstantial evidence that the reason why you are not Secretary of the Army today is because of these charges that were leveled against you. I can only say as one member of Congress that I'm deeply saddened by what has happened to you and your family. I hope you will accept at least the apology of this member and many of the people that I represent for what has been done to you in your efforts to do your duty as you see best to this nation. And if there's any additional information about your background that we could add to the record to indicate your service to this nation, I'd appreciate it if you'd submit it to the record.
Thank you very much, and you have no apology to anyone, Senator McCain, for anything.
Would the Senator simply yield for in addition to that, if I could ask, what is it about this issue? I mean, share with us some sort of personal light about this. There's a vitriol that gets into this, and a level of anger and frustration, some of which I know comes from just the frustration that the government hasn't done the job. Government hasn't delivered. But I don't want to testify to it. I want to hear your explanation of why you think this has happened and what it means in the context of this issue.
I'll tell you why it happened to me, in my view. Others can speak for themselves. First of all, the war divided us, and this is a continuation of the war in a way. It's a continued division in our ranks. It's a sign of the frustration that exists when you lose a war, the inability to get answers, number one. Number two, in terms of my personal involvement, It is my view that I took a very public stance on this issue in 1981 and continued to take a public stance on the issue as we changed the live sighting report to be more reflective of the possibility of Americans being alive. And also as we took on various peoples who were trying to make a living, in my view, out of this issue by taking advantage of families, particularly families of the missing in action. And I publicly, in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives, took these people on. Time after time. I had the cojones to do it, and I've paid a price for that. And you know that's the truth. And that's what it's about. It is about frustration. It is about identifying someone who does stand up and has a view, and that person becomes a lightning rod. And that's what happened.
What was the view that you expressed?
It depends on the issue. I spoke one time about Mr. Greitz, who was alleging that he had provided the committee with, or provide the U.S. government with remains of American servicemen, that he could continue this. The fact of the matter is those remains were pig and chicken bones. And I so testified in front of a huge hearing, much larger than this today, to the hoots and the derision of the gallery, as you can imagine. Just testifying to the truth. Someone has to do it. The same thing had to do with a ring which was being offered for money, a ring of a POW MIA, which was being offered by one or another of these folks who, in my words, were trying to make a living from the issue. Trying to get money from a family of a missing serviceman. And I spoke out publicly in hearings.
Well, let the record show, Mr. Armitage, we have 4 people now working on that kind of issue, and before this committee is finished, we will publicly air the question of exploitation and fraud. I think everybody in their right mind has got to admit at this point in time that it has happened. A number of pictures surfaced in this past year with families with extraordinary certainty and tears and all of the frustration of years coming out, identifying loved ones, only to find weeks later, after the certainty had been expressed, that indeed those photographs were fraudulent. And they weren't just a photograph that showed up. They were specifically put together to purport to be specific people. That is an amazing distance to travel to torture people over this issue.
Yes, it is.
So the country must understand the full measure of that. And do you have anything you want to add to that aspect of this issue?
To the cover-up, or rather to the scam artists, et cetera. No, I'm, like many others, awaiting the outcome of your deliberations. I can't wait. I remember in 1986, I think it was, or 84, after one of the trips to Hanoi, I gave a rather major press conference in Bangkok, and I had found already that these independent operators were very much not only distracting attention in the U.S. government, but really giving the Vietnamese a great deal of glee. And I came out in Bangkok, and I blasted those who would profit in any way off this issue. And I can mark myself from that moment when the personal problems on this issue started.
Chairman, may I?
Thank you, Senator McCain. I apologize.
Thank you very much,
We will
Mr.
give
Chairman.
you extra.
General Peroots, first of all, let me establish there is no doubt in your mind, and it's substantiated by a memo, that Major Smith and Mr. Hendon, former Congressman Hendon, had stated that they had names from the tape.
Yes.
There's no doubt in your mind whatsoever. You remember it vividly.
Yes.
I'd like to, if I could amend for a moment, move to the issue of the so-called cluster theory. As you see, that's a very impressive map with lots of flags in it, and we had some references to it at yesterday's hearing. Have you, as part of your work, when you were head of DIA, did you also crank into the decision-making process this cluster situation, number one? And number two, what is your professional opinion of this cluster theory that has been pervaded in the last few weeks as some kind of compelling evidence that there were, quote, Americans left alive or are still Americans alive in Southeast Asia?
The clustering analysis is not new. We began, any analyst would determine the extent of activity in an area to cue collection, et cetera. We've been doing that for years. I went one step beyond that, Senator McCain. somewhat in response to the, quote, debunking offensive, you know. And when you were talking about these photos, Mr. Kerry, Senator Kerry, the courage that these analysts must have to say that we don't believe that is a valid photo puts them very often in the category of debunking. So it's a two-way street. But I went beyond that, and I said, and I brought in the analysts that weren't involved even with the regular investigation. I went to what we call our production part of DIA. I said, you are professional analysts that do operational analysis in intelligence across the board, not only for, I want you to assume that every report is valid report. I want you to cluster them. I want you to determine, at the same time I had this concept which was implemented of developing a capability to do more on the ground. And that's all I'll say here. And my idea was, again, to send a message to the American people that notwithstanding the fact that we don't have the precise geographic locations, and notwithstanding the fact that we don't have the very hard, pervasive evidence, that perhaps we'll have at least a key to put an indigenous team to go look and come back and say, we tried another thing. And so they did that. And they came up with, essentially, I suppose, maybe the pattern would be similar to, because it's basically where the activity was. But I would caution anybody by taking that quantum leap of saying that constitutes any hard evidence that there's a single living American there.
Because of the methodology used.
Of course. That's a statistical reporting analysis. That's what that is.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, there's a lot of questions I'd like to ask this panel, and I know we have another panel waiting, so I would conclude. Thank you for your patience, and I thank the panel for being here.
Thank you, Senator McCain. Senator Reid.
Mr. Chairman, let me ask this question. You've indicated, General, that you don't know of any hard evidence that there's anyone alive now. In your expert opinion, based on all the information that you had at your disposal and now have at your disposal, after Operation Homecoming in 1973, do you feel that there were people left behind, Americans left behind, other than Garwood?
Yes, sir, I do.
Pull the mic up to you. I interrupted your answer. I want you to answer again, but pull the mic up, could you please?
He said, yes, I do. And upon what do you base that, General?
I base it on much of the evidence that this committee has seen. The fact and the logic that says that with so many live sighting reports, with so many reports that indicate that they were live at the time, we should have gotten more, especially out of Laos.
The question that we've gotten almost unanimous agreement on is that it's doubtful if any people are now alive. Would you agree with that?
You know, Senator, I hope you don't think I'm evading the question by saying I don't know.
Okay.
I just don't know. If you ask me the question, I will honestly respond that I don't think, and let me tell you why, that there's an organized, institutionalized effort to hold a number of people for whatever reasons, barter, etc. It defies my logic. It defies what I know to be an intense intelligence effort that we've applied that I think would give us a key somewhere on the penal system, the medical system. And I found myself, as I listened to the hearings all night, Senator Kerry, somewhat feeling pretty good about many of the things that we did that Ross was recommending, like a full court press and NSA. We put a full 6-month effort to relook at the tapes, like don't pay attention to what happened yesterday, let's go on. We did that. And frankly, I just have to believe that we would have triggered some, and to include third world diplomats, etc., that we mobilized that had access in those days. I never got the key, so I don't think, my own view, that we're going to find a smoking gun that says that Laos or North Vietnam have, in a formal way, kept these people for leverage. I don't think so. Now, if you're asking me, is there even some Americans kept against their will, perhaps in a cave, by a chieftain somewhere in Laos, or even perhaps with a family, I'm more inclined to support that. And I do believe
You're inclined to say that's possible.
that could, yes. And I do believe, frankly, that we have to go on that assumption.
Ambassador Armitage, would you agree with the general?
I'm not sure where he ended up, Senator. I think what I'd say is I believe that there are Americans in Indochina. I don't know the circumstances. But we do know, and it was my acting assumption from my very personal involvement from the early 70s with people who became POWs, who were colleagues of mine, comrades in arms, and who did not return at Operation Homecoming, that people were left behind. Consequently, it is my view today that people are there. I cannot prove that to you. I cannot prove what conditions they're there under.
In other words, you mean they may be living freely?
They may be living freely.
Ambassador, so I understand what you're saying. You agree with the general that after Operation Homecoming, there were Americans left alive in Southeast Asia?
I do.
Fair statement?
I do.
And you have elaborated on what the general said in giving your personal opinion that today you believe that it is possible that there are Americans still alive in Southeast Asia.
Indeed so, Senator.
Mr. Childress, what is your comment regarding that of the ambassador and the general?
I think I believe there's a possibility of Americans in Southeast Asia in some category that is not defined. I don't know if anyone's being held prisoner. I would add that if they've all perished, the discrepancy cases, and I think it's important to remember that Vietnam could solve the live prisoner issue by returning their remains. So the key question is, if they're not alive, why is Vietnam not solving it?
Ambassador Armitage, I frankly didn't hear your answer, so I'd like you to repeat it. You had how many tours of duty in the military in Southeast Asia?
I had 1 on a destroyer off the gun line as a volunteer and 3 voluntary tours with the Vietnamese riverine. I was an advisor.
What did you do on those? How many? Once on a ship, and what else?
3 inland. I was an ambush team advisor.
You worked with the South Vietnamese?
That's correct. For 2 tours, I was an ambush team advisor, and 1 tour, I was senior advisor to a 20-boat RPD, River Patrol Division.
Okay, just briefly tell me, you were an ambush advisor. Tell me what you did. I mean, I'm not military, I don't know.
We set up, no, there's no great secret. We set up ambushes on my first tour about, let's say, 130 times during the course of that first year. We were trying to interdict lines of communication. This was in South Vietnam, and these were lines of communication primarily of the Viet Cong and not the North Vietnamese.
And when you went on your 3rd tour of duty, your heads were dealing with on a boat?
No, the second in-country tour, I was on a patrol craft not unlike Senator Kerry's. I had 20 of them under my purview as senior advisor. That was on the Cambodian border. And then the 3rd tour, I was in 2 Corps, again as a senior advisor, but also as an ambush team advisor. And this time we were dealing with NVAs, not Viet Cong.
And these tours of duty were how long each one of them?
First one was a year, the second one was 9 months, and the last one was about 7 months.
Now,
the ship was a 9-month deployment.
The reason I've laid this foundation is to get your opinion on a statement made by one of our witnesses yesterday, a man by the name of Muir. Is that how you pronounce it? Muir. He said that he talked to a Chinese man that in effect said that if in fact there were prisoners being held, there would be no reason for the Southeast Asians to keep them alive once, you know, they're kind of in the way. I'm paraphrasing what he said. And you having lived literally with the Southeast Asians for 3 or 4 years of your life. What is your comment on that?
I think that's a very dangerous assumption to make. I don't understand why they'd keep people alive. I don't understand why they won't tell us what they know. I know that they lied to us about Bobby Garwood, and he came out. They lied initially, at least a lie of silence on the Schwab case when Dick Childress in the main and me secondarily were probably the only 2 people outside of Schwab's parents who thought he was alive. I don't know why they do this, but I wouldn't underestimate their own revenge and their own hatred.
We asked that question with respect to Garwood, and their answer was, he asked us not to tell until a certain point of time. I'm just saying what they say. But the minute he said he wanted to go home, he went home. That's their answer.
Yes, sir.
So the point is, Mr. Ambassador, you're having spent as much time as you did in that part of the world, you understand how little you know about the reasons that they do things. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I think I'd rather say that I'm not going to apply our standards to them.
It's fair, though, that you don't understand their reasoning, why they do things, as much as you spent time...
Well, no, I understand why they do a lot of things, and I think all of you do as well. I think why they try to divide the American nation on this issue, just as they did during the war, it's good strategy. I can't tell you why they might keep Americans alive, nor can I tell you, prisoners, and nor can I tell you that there are prisoners. I can just tell you my personal belief that there are Americans in Indochina under some conditions.
And this is based upon a general knowledge you have of all the facts, not any hard facts that you can point to saying, I know that they're alive and I have a general idea where they might be.
There are no hard facts that I can point to, but I can point to you that I'm a victim or a beneficiary of my background just as all of you are. My background was very personal in this issue with a friend of mine who was captured, and I spent 2 nights on a canal trying to be a blocking force to keep him from being extricated from the area, and we were unsuccessful. And through the length of my tour, kept getting reports about this man being moved from place to place. So I was in early, and it affected me and how I feel about this issue. This man did not return in Operation Homecoming. Later, at the fall of Saigon, at the very day it fell, I saw Americans of all sizes and shapes coming out of the woodwork to either get on the boats, in which I was with, or to go to Tan Son Nhut to get on aircraft. They were on nobody's list, no one's list of anything. In the late 70s, as I worked for Bob Dole, the National League of Families, I came up and worked hard with Senator Dole, and I was at the AA, they worked hard with me, making sure this issue stayed alive. So I've been very much affected by my background in this. This thing's been kept alive in my mind. We didn't have any dead periods.
Ambassador, how do you think that your name has gotten, what reasons has your name gotten so involved in you being part of the drug traffic and from the Golden Triangle? And, I've seen this, and I'm sure you have more than I have.
Oh, I believe it originated in the Christic Institute, and you'd have... Well, who knows? I think that whole episode, as far as I know, was out of whole cloth, and even the Christic Institute had the decency to remove it from a subsequent submission in an affidavit because they had no basis for any of their allegations. For instance, I was a midshipman at the Naval Academy during some of the time I was allegedly working in the Golden Triangle. I've never been there. I was Bob Dole's AA during a subsequent time when I was allegedly the CIA station chief. So when people make this out of whole cloth and others, for their own purposes, want to perpetrate it.
Would my friend just, I think about another important factor here. All these allegations were investigated by the FBI, isn't that true?
Twice, to my understanding, Senator, and by the GAO, and internally in the Pentagon, and not a few congressmen and senators have looked at it.
And the results were all totally...
baseless and groundless, and further, I believe if you check with the FBI, you'll find that they reside in a cadre of activists on this issue. They have their origin, the common point.
Mr. Chairman, one last question. I know my time is up. What we hear when we go home, town hall meetings and other places, is that even though we've spent days of our time, staff has spent months of their time taking depositions and trying to find out what's gone on in Southeast Asia, and you men have all spent a good part of your life dealing with this issue, that we're confronted with a general cover-up, that there's a as Senator McCain has mentioned a cover-up, that there's a conspiracy that because people were left behind, because there was a policy decision made in the high levels of our government, that you and I guess us, we are part of this cover-up to keep information from the American public. How do you respond to this?
If you try to get this down to a situation of consensus where everyone agrees with you, you will fail. It is not possible, I believe, to get a consensus on the issue. The only thing we can do is, I think, internally, when I was active in the department, we had 7 different investigations. Each one showed that there was no conspiracy and cover-up. We have to depend on whatever you find to help in this issue, but it's not going to resolve it, and it's not going to eliminate in the minds of some the fact that now you are part of this conspiracy. I can't help you.
But you can understand, and I'm beginning to see something here. Frankly, we've been at this for 7 months, and I'm beginning to see some things emerge here. I mean, you have all agreed, as have many other people in front of us, that it looks as though some folks were left behind, correct?
Correct. Yes. And we said it publicly.
And in I understand, but you did and you didn't, because you also understand that the Defense Department in 1973 had a major statement come out saying, and the President said, they're all home. The Defense Department said, they're all dead. They also said, nobody's alive. So beginning in 1973, you had cross currents that were at work. You had one part of the nation being told, everybody's accounted for, or they're dead. But you had this other group who understood that wasn't true, correct? Well, there it is. I mean, that's the beginning of it. And for 20 years, the people who understood that it wasn't true have pounded away and pounded away. And as you said yourself, we overclassified. So they didn't get a lot of answers. I mean, you would not have had to raise this, Mr. Childress, to a new level of concern in 1985 if it had been raised to its level of concern necessary previous, correct?
Absolutely.
So it's perfectly normal that there was a frustration growing and building. You're shaking your head, Mr. Childress.
No, it's obvious on the face of it, and I think I've said the frustration has grown. I think we added to it by our very public stance, but I don't know.
But the point I make is, I'm sorry to interrupt you, is that there really is no mystery about where all this cry about conspiracy comes from. I can understand how people would get frustrated after pounding away at the doors of government for 10 years, believing a loved one is over there and alive with cause to believe it. And then you arrive 10 and 12 years later and you're still not getting answers. I mean, this is not complicated.
I jumped into the issue in an official way in 1981, and I know that when my colleagues and the National League got very active in this and raised the priority and did all these things, initially for the first several years, I believe it's fair to say we were greeted with great enthusiasm across the board. Across the board. Now, there were some pockets, but as a general matter, we weren't suffering cries of cover-up and conspiracy. There was a lot of bemoaning the inattention and what didn't go on from 73 to 81. The first couple of years, it was a honeymoon, if you will. And it was only laterally. And I trace it in my personal involvement to that rather dramatic press conference in Bangkok, which I gave. That's just a personal anecdote. But.
Well, I think it's an astute one. Senator Grassley. Senator Grassley?
Yes, I have questions of 2 of you. I'd start with you, Ambassador.
Yes, sir.
After the fall of Saigon and before you went to work for Senator Dole, could you tell us what you were doing?
Yes, until Mr. Ford lost the election, I was a part of the defense representative staff in Iran, trying to, particularly with Navy and Special Operations Program, on the staff of a Mr. Eric von Marbod. When the election was lost, I came back to the United States for some period of time and then went back to Thailand along with a retired brigadier general in the Air Force to try to start a business. And I would be 2 weeks in Thailand and 2 weeks back in California. It was very unsuccessful, and after a couple of months gave it up, and then I joined Senator Dole. I was here in the area.
What was the business you were trying to get started?
We had a tour business an organization, a tour business, originally trying to encourage tours to Southeast Asia. That was too hard to do. We got into rattan, which for me was also too hard to do, Senator.
Okay. General Peroots, did you ever observe in the DIA POW office any indication of what we term here the mindset to debunk?
The charge of debunking was so pervasive when I assumed the position of director that I attacked it immediately. And perhaps even with overkill, not only moving people around, putting new people in, establishing a group that so that one person couldn't debunk, personally getting involved. So, but certainly there was evidence based on the Gaines report, an internal report, that there was very often a unconscious, and sometimes perhaps even conscious, mindset that comes with, Gene used to tell me, General Ty, they're burnt out, they're tired. Here's another one, that kind of a thing. But I can honestly say, and I say this with no motive to stroke myself, that during my tour, once we launched these initiatives that I articulated, it was very difficult to have cases of debunking.
On another point, it appears to us that, or at least to me, that human intelligence sources exploited for the POW information in Indochina, at least since 1975, have been nearly exclusively Vietnamese, Laos, and Cambodian refugees. So, General Peroots, within the boundaries of security, could you comment on the apparent absence of any aggressive, positive human intelligence collection effort?
Well, one of the reasons, of course, there wasn't a more aggressive, positive human intelligence action was resources, was the climate that was articulated here during the time, was the fact that after the operation in Laos Panhandle, there was a sort of "I told you so" attitude. I again was concerned about that, and we launched an initiative to establish within DOD this capability. Now there were some human capabilities other than the refugees. There were some military collection efforts. There were, of course, the entire attaché arena. There were other human sources that were being exploited during this period. But as far as a programmed, on-the-ground effort, it was very weak.
Referring to your words that you just used, that you tried to establish within DOD some human intelligence efforts, the extent to which you tried to get them established, were you successful in getting them established to the degree you wanted to?
Well, never to the degree that no intelligence officer is satisfied with what he got. But yes, we were.
The extent to which you didn't get what you wanted, what would you say the major reason was?
Resources.
Budget?
Well, personnel resources, budget resources. For every individual that we put out there that's a military, has to come from the services. And of course it has to be funded. Now, again, I was satisfied with the support that I got, and it's been implemented and it's growing. And I think you have briefings on the program.
Okay. General, again, on another point, did you ever see any intelligence information that strongly suggested to you that American POWs were transported from Vietnam or Laos to the Soviet Union or to China?
I cannot recall of a single hard piece of evidence during my term as director.
Mr. Chairman, that completes my questioning.
Thank you very much, Senator Grassley. What we'll do here is try to
wrap this panel up if we can in the course of the next half hour. We're going to go straight through here. Senator Baker, Mr. Cannon are the only two members of the next panel, and I think that will not be as long a panel. So I think it's good for us to just hang in and go through. I'd like to pursue a number of areas, if I can, quickly, and I appreciate, incidentally, the sharpness and brevity of your answers. I think it's helpful to the committee to be able to move through this that way. Obviously, where you want to add anything, we welcome you're doing so. I want to try to think out a little bit the resolution of this and deal with hard realities in doing so. And you've all sat around the table and you've talked these things out in private, not always in public. But here we are in 1992. We have a body of evidence that grows older in many regards. The live sighting reports, certainly live sighting report that somebody saw somebody in 1975 or 76 might help now establish whether someone was really there. But I think we've basically established that potential. There are people to be accounted for. And this issue will be resolved only through that accounting. Now, it's been measured, but it's happening. Of General Vessey's 135 people, and our 130 some, and DIA's probably additional number, some 57, if I am correct, have been repatriated as remains. We have had remains come, is that not correct? How many is the number?
Senator, right?
I see Ann, it's not that many. What is the number?
It's not 57 out of the 135. It's 57 in addition to the 135, and those are confirmed dead but remains not yet repatriated in the hands of the police.
So there have been 57 remains repatriated. Outside of those, we still have question marks, very serious question marks. In many cases, it's our belief the Vietnamese can answer these. Now, a number of you have said the Vietnamese can easily answer this. They can tell us this can be handled. Now, I don't really, I'm trying to be pragmatic here. I don't want to carry a brief on any side except an honest resolution of this. I'm not sure it's fair to say that the Vietnamese can easily resolve every one of these cases. In some cases, you've got units that may have had a prisoner, they may have been on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we may have bombed the living whatever out of it, and the whole unit was wiped out, including our prisoner. Is that correct?
Sure.
Correct? Yes. Who is around to give an accounting of that?
Senator, if I could, based upon our database alone, when I left, our estimate was that the Vietnamese could account for hundreds of cases easily. Clearly not all of them. We told the Vietnamese that we have certain cases that we know will never be accounted for.
For the record, Mr. Childress, that was 1985.
No.
That was when?
1989 I left.
89.
Right.
How many cases have been accounted for since that time?
I'd have to look. We did 175 from 81 to 89. I understand this year and the year before, the two worst since 82.
Okay.
In terms of returns of remains. Now, they can, and when I say resolve easily hundreds of cases, I mean you either have a live prisoner who remains or an explanation why neither is possible through archival research or the rest. And in those categories, there are many hundreds of cases they can resolve for us. Beyond that, you're talking long-term efforts, maybe crash site excavations, maybe never finding anything. Our problem of always defining what's the fullest possible accounting has been, we only have our database. We don't know what the Vietnamese database is.
Agreed.
But in a full cooperative effort between our governments, and they're cooperating, we'll know when we get there.
Okay, now, it's fair to say that the 135 or so that we're dealing with as a universe represents the best potential for the easiest resolution. Is that correct? These are the cases we have the biggest question mark about which they should know the most, and we ought to be able to get an answer.
From our database, that's correct.
Okay.
And the ones that are most likely alive, if there are any alive.
And the ones that were most likely alive at some point in time.
Some point in time.
Now, when I was over there most recently, I was again struck by the fact that when a Caucasian walks around in Vietnam, it is not an incident of small notice. Is that, you all would agree with that?
Particularly when you're 6'4" or whatever you are.
Particularly if you're 6'4". But if, you know, when any Caucasian is around, it's still in Vietnam something of curiosity, fairly significant curiosity.
Yes.
I mean, hundreds of kids. I walk into a village, you'd be surrounded by 150 people. It's very hard to understand how Americans could be moved or moving without a community noticing it in a way that would create ripples of information at some point. Do you not agree, or do you think that's wrong?
I agree. If they're not afraid to chat or talk, that's true.
Well, if you have people out in the countryside, is it your experience that there's a difficulty in getting people to sort of talk or chat?
I'm not sure that since the fall of Saigon, we've had so many people out. Generally, people talk to us in these crash site investigations.
What I'm getting at is this. When I was there, we met with the British ambassador, the French ambassador, the New Zealand, Italian, and one other country, I can't remember. To a person, they said to me, "Senator, you folks are crazy. You're denying yourself access to Vietnam. We go all over the country, our people. Our field people from our embassy are all over the country. We're all over the country." I met with the NGOs. The NGOs, all of them, the non-governmental organizations, said, "We're all over the country. We go places." Our people, because of this constraint within which we're operating, don't move as freely as the people from these embassies or the NGOs. Now, it just strikes me, and maybe I'm dead wrong, and I'm prepared to be told I'm dead wrong and shown why, but somehow it seems to me common sense that if we had people with that kind of access around the country, we're going to learn a hell of a lot faster whether somebody's alive or what might have happened to somebody. Now, am I wrong?
Yes, sir. I think I said the same thing.
All right, you think I'm wrong and you don't.
I don't think you're wrong.
Who wants to go first?
You're not totally wrong, Senator. I think the premise is that by walking around the countryside, somehow we're going to find a prisoner. My premise would be, or information on them, that if at this late date the Vietnamese are holding Americans alive, they are not going to be anywhere accessible to people just walking around. It would be a state secret of such magnitude.
Good.
That
I'm glad you said that. All right, I want that on the record because it's part of what has to be put here. But I want your piece too, and then I'll come back to you.
Oh, I said in answer to an earlier query from you, Senator, what it would take to resolve the issue, that one of the things it would take would be a lot of free access, unannounced, et cetera. So I'm in the main in agreement with you. To the extent we've got free access, then we'll be a lot better off. I'm not sure, though, that having villagers crowd around you and chat with you is the same thing as getting information from them.
Well, I agree, but look, here's what I'm looking at. I want to come back to you because this is the nub of it. This is where we are today. This is where we are today. We got 58 American military personnel going out into the countryside, going to prisons, asking questions. You got Ross Perot saying that's crazy. You got other people thinking it's crazy. A rational examination of it says if they're truly holding somebody, they're going to do it exactly as Mr. Childress said. So what you're going to learn, however, is reality-based. you could go into a village and somebody may learn, gee, you know, in 1975 there were 3 Americans living here. And this was their name, and by God, they lived with us, and we used to eat there, but then they left and they went to Thailand or something, whatever. You just cull information and you build relationships. And from that, you can gain a reality base. But coming back to your point, and this is the key where the country finds itself today. If the only way someone would be alive today in captivity is indeed as a matter of state secret, and I'll accept that that would be the only way I think the government would hold them, if they were, then the only way you get them is through negotiation, correct?
An admission through negotiations, or if our intelligence was good enough to pick up the state secret.
Okay. Well, you've got to find a rationale for them holding them in a way that it is so necessary our intelligence doesn't discover it, so that they can then someday use them as a chit for something if that's what they're holding them for. Otherwise, there's no reason for them to hold this great secret and go to such lengths, correct?
Well, that's always the dilemma. Why haven't they come out?
I want to deal with whether it's a dilemma or a fiction or a reality. Now, let's assume they were holding them. We've gone 20 years now. There isn't one American official who comes forward and says, with one exception possibly, and we don't know the truth of this one yet, that there is an offer of money, ransom, exchange. Ken Quinn's been over there. You've been over there. General Vessey's been over there. John McCain's been over there. I've been over there. Senator Smith's been over there. Senator Grassley's been there. Bob Kerry's been there. Senator Graham's been there. A lot of people have been there. Never once has there been an offer. If you do A, B, C, and D, we will give you these people. Now, I would assume President Reagan would have immediately taken them up on that, would he not?
We worked the early years of this. The whole point of the negotiations on the live prisoner issue was to try to get an admission and make sure that the Vietnamese knew that we would handle it quietly and sensitively and work with them and try to get them to tell us what they needed for it. I mean, I would have loved...
So overtures were made,
absolutely.
Correct? And you made one, did you not, Mr. Childress?
I have made several. Getting an admission doesn't necessarily mean paying for anything. But you can't negotiate till you get the admission. So we were working for that.
Right. All right, now help me, because this is where you get into this crazy catch-22 for our nation. And for the Vietnamese, frankly, for the whole region, for our policy. We have American businesses that today could be providing jobs to Americans. The Germans are in there, the Japanese are in there, the French are in there. The United States is holding back because our policy is we want a full accounting for POW. They tell us we're not holding anybody. We say, well, we need a full accounting. They say we're not holding anybody. You have all agreed that the likelihood, the only way they'd be holding them is if it's in secret and they're holding them. So there's no deal to be cut, but we keep denying ourselves any sort of change of policy, movement, or anything until they answer us. They answer us saying we don't have anybody. We say that's not sufficient, so we don't move forward. You go round and around and around. And if somebody were indeed there, living freely or held somewhere else other than by the government, we don't advance our capacity to find that out, except through this very prolonged process. Now, how does this come to an end, gentlemen? How do the Vietnamese satisfy you that when they say we've given you everything we have, or we've answered those questions to the best of our ability, that you really have, and that you can say, gee, we believe they're not holding somebody?
Senator, they have refused to resolve the live prisoner issue. If there's no one there, they can resolve it. There is some element by return of remains.
But supposing they can't get at some remains or don't have them or don't know where they were, you say they could return all of them.
I am absolutely convinced in my mind that all of the discrepancy cases that are of high priority.
I agree on the discrepancies.
Okay, those are the focus of the live prisoner issue. And we told the Vietnamese that if they're alive, we want them back. If they're dead, we want their remains. And I've told them point blank.
Or a better explanation of...
Or a better explanation why they can't be recovered. But there are elements in the Politburo, obviously in Hanoi, whether there's anybody alive or not, have made a decision not to resolve the live prisoner issue.
So if you were in Vietnam today trying to understand this and reading this transcript or listening to this, the clear message would be that if those 135 can be resolved, then the issue is resolved? Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is that in a context of them rapidly resolving the discrepancy cases in our database that we're of highest concern about, then we're seeing a sustainable process where we can start moving down the roadmap rapidly and get to the very things they want. If you lose your leverage in that context, they have no motivation after that to perform. I mean, the way the Vietnamese operate, the way they negotiate is precisely that way. If you give up your leverage, what do they do then?
Okay, but you say if you give up your leverage, I'll come back to that in a minute. You wanted to say something, Ambassador?
I just want to see if we've got one piece of common ground. I'm not sure we do. You made the very correct comment, Senator, that what if a unit had been obliterated and had an American POW, there'd be no record. And that's something that I generally agree with. But it is my experience, both with the South and the North, and I believe it's more generally an experience in communist countries, that record-taking is an art form. And we're kidding ourselves if we think they don't have fairly good records on who was where when. This is what they do to make up for all the work they're not doing in terms of economic development, et cetera. This was exactly the theory that we operated under on the Schwab case, feeling that if this gentleman was dead, their Public Security Bureau would know it, because no fisherman would dare come upon a Caucasian body without reporting it. So I think you've got to, at least I would hope that you would agree with me that record keeping, the Vietnamese were probably pretty good at it, and that they, consequently, they've got a lot more information than we've seen thus far. If you don't agree with that, then we're not on the same playing field, I don't think.
We agree. The committee is in agreement with you that the record keeping is pretty good. We now have access to many of the archives we never have had access to.
But I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, in relation to what Ambassador Armitage is saying, that remember that Colonel Bui Tin indicated clearly to this committee that there was a significant amount of information that he knew that was at the disposal of the Vietnamese government, which they have not made available to the United States. And I think that's a very important point that's being made here.
So if when the 135 or so that we think would most lend themselves to resolution are resolved, but the Vietnamese still say, we don't hold anybody alive, do we accept their resolution at that point?
My own opinion is that the 135 or whatever the discrepancy number is now is our database solely. We don't know what the Vietnamese know in their database over and above that. But I would say that if the Vietnamese respond in a substantive way to the 135, then we have narrowed the possibility of live prisoners significantly. And in the context of them continuing to cooperate that way, which I would assume they would continue, then we're getting pretty close to answering the question.
And the roadmap then permits additional activities which reward that kind of response.
Exactly.
Chairman, I have one additional question, if you don't mind, very quickly. It's hard to always respond to these blizzards of allegations that fly over the transom, but there was one that I think needs to be responded to. General Peroots or our other two witnesses might want to. The statement about that refugees are not only discouraged but are punished if they bring forth a live sighting report. Would you not only mention whether it's true, but also state what the policy is and what you would do if you heard of such activity of discouraging or punishing refugees who might have information about live Americans? General, do you want to respond?
My information, I've been there, and on the basis of what the reports that I have, it's quite the contrary. But our problem is, as we raise the flag immediately, if there's any information on PW's MIAs, that they respond to that to get to the head of the line, they get special treatment, and they know that. Word gets out, you start getting the I've cautioned our people not to be influenced by that, but to continue to ask the question. But the policy is, I frankly have never had a case. I was somewhat surprised at Ross's allegation, while I do remember him mentioning a DEA fellow that I think he even paid his salary that he put out there, but I don't recall any instances where there was any indication or evidence of them being punished or they're being reluctant to come forward.
Senator, I've traveled to camps with our interviewers up and down the border, and many times during the 80s, quite the contrary. The refugees are treated well. They voluntarily come forward, and if we had any evidence that an interviewer was doing something light, he should be summarily taken out of the issue.
That would be the quickest way to get resettlement in the United States if a refugee could show that he'd been mistreated or subjected to pressure not to give information. That particular person would be airmailed here immediately, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Smith.
Mr. Chairman, one of the flaws in the argument that the reason why the Vietnamese may not hold anybody is that they've never made any overtures. Well, we don't know that for a fact, but assuming they haven't, the reason may be that they don't want to make any overtures. I don't mean to make light of this issue, but as an example, the farmer who had a little puppy, and his neighbor came over and asked him if he would take $500 for that puppy, and he said, no, it's my son's, it's a pet, and I'm not going to part with it, and that's that. The guy then said, would you take $5,000 for the puppy? And with that, the farmer said, would you like a receipt? And I think the issue here is that if, in fact, there is a willingness, trying to figure out the psyche of the Vietnamese or the Lao is something we've all been trying to do for years, and we haven't been very successful at it. We do know, and I think you were very correct, Mr. Childress, with what you said about the fact that they have withheld information. And if they did resolve simply, I don't believe that the universe is just the discrepancy cases. There's some disagreement on the committee on that, but I don't believe that is the case. But even, just sticking to those cases for a moment, that universe, you're right. They certainly know what happened to those people. They were filmed alive in some cases, seen alive in some cases at the time of incident. So we know they know, and they haven't told us that. And if they haven't told us that, why would they tell us that they were holding somebody in a prison somewhere? And the other thing is that in terms of prisoners, I don't know about you, but unless my brother was in there, God forbid he's not, or my next door neighbor, I couldn't tell you who's in the prisons around here. Does anybody know who's in Walton or some other prison? I don't have the slightest idea, and I don't see them on a day-to-day basis. So all that's just nonsense as far as I'm concerned. It's absolute nonsense. The truth of the matter is that if the Vietnamese have people, they're going to give them to us when they want to. But let me come back to a couple of points. Specifically, in terms of the issue, and sometimes we're all, I very much sympathize with you, Mr. Armitage, in terms of some of the personal abuse. I've had a good share of it myself, as we all have who've been in this issue. It seems like that's the nature of the beast, that if you're involved in this issue, you have to wear a bulletproof vest. But maybe in the end, it'll all be worth it. But, the thing that bothers me is the war that we have between the executive and the legislative branch on this, at least that's taken place while I've been involved, and I think it's been true before that. And there's no reason why, and it's not directed at you because you are not in that high a position. But there is no reason, you were in high positions, but not as high as I'm getting at. There is no reason why some president, from Nixon to Bush, couldn't have said, enough is enough, I want a full-scale investigation on this whole matter. I want to know what happened. I want to see those documents. I want to put it all together. We're going to flush this thing out. That did not happen. And that's not meant to be critical on anybody in particular, but it just didn't happen. We're doing it. And I'll tell you something, it's damn hard for us to get this information from the executive branch. It's not easy. And sometimes it's simply a matter of witnesses, perhaps like yourself, who simply don't have the answers that we're asking for. Somebody else may have, but if we don't know who has them and we don't ask for those people, we don't get to see those people. And if we're told that if you want a specific document, Senator, ask for it. Well, if I don't know what the document is, how can I ask for it? You know, and this has been the ongoing. I just might just take a brief response on that because I have several questions that I want to get to, but I would appreciate just some type of response on that. Whether you think is that a fair question that somebody in the executive branch, whether it's the president or somebody he designates, could not have done this?
I think part of the problem is that, in this case, Senator, is when we came in 81 and 82, you had believers coming in who already knew about discrepancy cases and felt the ambiguity at the end of the war, left the possibility of prisoners being held. I mean, we didn't need an investigation. We knew it. We felt it. We didn't have to go back for documents. So we changed the policy based upon that knowledge to go forward. And I think we would have said we're investigating things we already know. Now, there are certainly specific things that you all have uncovered that I didn't see in detail, and they're quite interesting, but I still haven't seen anything that changed my basic feeling about the way the war ended and what we were pursuing yet.
Do any of the three of you know either firsthand or did you hear any hearsay information about an offer in 1981 by the Vietnamese to then President Reagan early in his administration?
It came up publicly in the mid-'80s. I called my predecessor, because I took over in January of '82, to check it out. He said he had never heard of it. He would have known. I think I put in a call to Dick Allen. I don't know if it was returned or not. I can't remember. But it was one of the rumors that hit in the mid-'80s. Also tried to check calendars to see if meetings had taken place. I came to the conclusion, everything they told me, that the meeting and the offer didn't take place. I see it's back on the agenda. But
so is that your response as well, Mr. Armitage? Well, General Peroots, I know you weren't. Excuse me, you were not at DIA at the time, but do you have any information? Did you get any information while you were in DIA that would substantiate the fact that there may have been an offer from the Vietnamese in 1981 to then President Reagan?
No, sir.
Any secondhand information? We have, as you know, three sources who have indicated that the opposite. I also spoke to a former high-level official in the intelligence community who indicated, although he had no direct knowledge of it, that there was a lot of comments, a lot of commentary, a lot of scuttlebutt throughout the agencies that, in fact, this meeting did take place and that there was an offer. Now, you know, that's all I'm saying. I don't know the circumstances of the offer. I don't know if it was a bogus offer. I'm not representing the offer. I'm just saying that's what we're being told. And all of you say that you don't have any knowledge.
I came after the event, but I can tell you that any hints at offers.
Who was your predecessor in that?
Bob Kerry for that year. But any hints of offers that were serious that we ever heard of, we followed all the way to its logical conclusion.
Nothing from Kimmett, no information from...
No, I asked Bob if he had heard of it, and he was responsible for the issue, and he had been the staff guy in the NSC. He told me he did not know of such a meeting or an offer.
Ms. Childers, were you involved in any offers regarding remains for money to the Vietnamese?
Offers by the Vietnamese?
In other words, an offer of United States dollars to the Vietnamese for money?
I've never been authorized nor offered money for remains or live prisoners. We have had and I don't want to go too far because we may have to get in closed session, but I want to, we have had third country notification to us that remains and perhaps live prisoners would be available to the United States for development aid or whatever.
Well, now, let me
we followed that up all the way to the Vietnamese.
Let's see that. Let me just, maybe you misspoke, but I may have to go back to the record on this. Now, you just said we've had offers or overtures from third-party nations regarding.
I'm talking about one specific overture in the mid-80s.
Regarding remains and live Americans.
We're getting this not directly from the Vietnamese. This is what I'm talking about following.
But I mean, you got it from a third party.
I got it from a third country. We followed it all the way up. It was not live prisoners at all, and we did not.
But I mean, could that have been the 81 meeting that we're talking about?
No. This is new. This is 85. I'd be glad in closed session to talk about the third country, how we ran it down. But I think if we go too far on that, it could affect current Vietnamese responsiveness or negotiations.
I want to pursue that in closed session.
Okay.
We have some other information that the committee's come into contact with regarding that, and it is important for us to do a closed session on that. So I'd like to pursue it with you.
Do we have the memorandum from DIA? Okay. I might wish to come back just momentarily. It's my understanding, General, that your office is providing a copy of the memorandum or whatever it was, or that you.
I just read it and asked them to make copies.
They're making copies. I haven't seen it yet, so I do want to come back to that. I want to revisit that point, Mr. Chairman, when I get that, and it should be in a moment. Okay. And if I could have that, I'll be happy to yield at the moment.
Let me ask you a question.
Give us live Americans. If they don't want to do it, then they wouldn't do it. I mean, if they don't want to do it, they won't do it. That's all.
Well, let me, we're about at the end of this panel. A point I'd like to underscore about having people also move around the country with access, et cetera, is not that you're going to, I mean, you got two choices here. Either people are out there in some form in which you can see them on occasion and therefore you're going to be helped, or they're not. They're totally secreted away, as you said. Okay. But if that's true, then that denies every single flag up there on the wall. I mean, every live sighting report that we have, every single one of them is somebody who saw people. And even the people in captivity, many of those reports report about captivity, are out in the open. What is bizarre, to say the least, is that in recent days we were told by the Soviet ambassador to Cambodia, who was the #2 person in Hanoi, that in 1986 Gorbachev personally contacted him to instruct him, per the administration's request, I assume, to ask all of their people in Vietnam whether there were any live Americans. And they informed us there were 5,000 technicians, Soviet personnel in Vietnam, which we did not know at that point in time, all of whom were asked to report back whether they knew of any live Americans in Vietnam. And this ambassador, who was the #2 person, said to me, nobody reported anything positive back to us. There was no report of any American in Vietnam. Secondly, not one of the embassies that have been operating there for years, a decade plus, has ever reported to us that any of their personnel have come across a live American, notwithstanding that they are moving all across the country. Not one of the NGOs operating in country has reported to us that they have come across a live American or seen a live American. So you really have to weigh the common sense reality here of all of these people who are moving around Vietnam. Now, the counter to that is always, you know, when you're with someone who wants to counter it, they will say to you, well, Senator, of course they're not going to see them. They're held in a secret place, right under your feet in the Ho Chi Minh tomb, for instance. I mean, that's where they are. Now, if that's true, then we will get them, as Senator Smith said, only when they decide they want to give them to you, which brings you back to the negotiation part of it. But if they're not held that way, if that is the only way they are held, then you cannot simultaneously make an argument that depends on live sighting reports. You can't have it both ways. So we've got to get some reality back into this. If they are taken out of prison and taken into a field and working in the rice paddies, as has been alleged, then you've got to have people around the country because you could find them. And if they're not, then you got to negotiate. Those are the only two ways that I think you kind of come at this. And we got to find a way to make sure we're doing both of those to a greater degree, or to the greatest degree possible. And I am not convinced that either are happening at this point in time, if this is indeed the highest national priority. Now, having said that, we're going to move on to the next panel momentarily. I think we have the copy of the memorandum here. I've just read through the memorandum, and I don't know if Senator Smith has questions on it. Indeed, the last paragraph says, there are 8 paragraphs. We will release this to the press. The last paragraph says, the question was asked, could Mark Smith identify any of the POWs? I might add, the date on this is 5 March 1986, memorandum for the record. Mark Smith, the question was asked, could Mark Smith identify any of the POWs from the tape or provide names of the POWs? Mark Smith's response was that he had names but would not provide them. Congressman Hendon made the same comment, that he had names also but would not provide them. As the meeting began to break up, Congressman Hendon reiterated that his role was that of a conduit between the two sides. So I don't have any questions on it. I don't know if Senator Smith does.
First of all, this is a memorandum not by you. Well, you indicated that it was your memorandum, so let's get that straight for the record, that this was Jim Schufeld's memorandum, who was your assistant. That's number one. Number two, the memorandum is a 2-page memorandum which goes into great detail about a number of people who were trying very hard to make some determination as to whether or not this was an accurate tape. As you know, I had called in, that's referenced in there, out of town, because I've been informed of it, and I was trying to get a meeting together. I'm trying to give a flavor for what this memorandum really is, which was not pointed out. I was trying to get a meeting together with the director of DIA to try to have him hear what Mark Smith was saying. Hendon was a conduit in terms of trying to get the meeting together, and the DIA did agree to a meeting at my request, and we met at, I believe it says here 5:15. I did not recall the time, but it was 5:15 in Hendon's office. There are 2 lines mentioned in here that were read by Senator Kerry. Mark Smith's response was he had names, would not provide them. Congressman Hendon made the same comment, he had names, would also not provide them. In the meantime, since this was brought up, I have had 2 phone calls placed to former Congressman Hendon, as well as Mark Waple, who was the attorney for Mark Smith throughout this process, both of whom deny any mention of names. I was present for the entire meeting. I do not recall any reference to names regarding that. I do recall a conversation, which was a side conversation, which is not mentioned in this, regarding Robert Garwood and some names that he was providing or would provide the DIA, and subsequently he did when we debriefed him. But the important thing here, Mr. Chairman, is we have the lawyer saying that there were no names provided. Mr. Hendon said there were no names provided, and I'm going to insist that all of the participants in that meeting be deposed on this subject, and also General Schufelt, because in the possibility he made a mistake. And I would just say this for the record. There was a hearing on this subject by Senator Murkowski. Yes. It was contentious, it was cantankerous, it was long, it was emotional. There was never a mention in the hearing of names.
I don't recall.
Well, I do. And I also was involved on a day-to-day basis, had agreed, much to the consternation of my wife and family, to go to Beirut, Lebanon, which was not exactly a vacation spot in 1986, along with some other individuals in the government and in the Congress, to go to try to view this tape in order to get it if it existed. And I can tell you right now, if I thought that there were names attached with it, it would have certainly been highlighted in my mind, and I really am going to stand toe-to-toe with you on this, because it's also a little bit of a shot at my credibility, and because of my involvement, this was not a one-meeting involvement with me. I participated in I listened to a 45-minute telephone conversation between the Vice President of the United States and Congressman Hendon about this issue, in which the Vice President encouraged, cajoled, every word that you could possibly imagine in the strongest terms to get the tape and do everything that we could to get that tape, and that all assets of the government would be provided to do that. And never was there ever a mention of names associated with that tape. Now, that does not mean that Mark Smith may not have said may not have had names, or may have said to somebody else he had names. He never said it to me. He didn't say it to Waple. He didn't say it to Hendon, and he didn't say it at this meeting, as I recall it, nor do any of the other participants recall it. So I just think it's important to point that out. And then also, some of those who have made comments about this publicly denied the existence of this meeting, denied the existence of the participation of the Vice President of the United States in this matter. So, I think it's important to get all of the facts on the record, and Mr. Chairman, I'm going to request that all of those people in that meeting be deposed, because I think it's very important. I don't know if there was a tape. I only know what I was told by Mr. Smith, as you do. If it was a fraud, it was another cruel, horrible hoax that many of us were willing to risk our lives for. I don't know that, but all I know is that all of those people involved, from the Vice President on down, I think acted properly. They tried, based on what Mr. Smith said, to secure that tape. But it adds another dimension to it when you say that there were names provided. And Smith described in great detail, Mark Smith, what he saw and what he said he saw in the tape. But as I say, there was never any mention of names in any of the conversations that I had with anybody on this issue or with any of the players.
Senator Smith,
I stand on that.
Fair. Your comments are noted. I would have been remiss had I not mentioned the existence of this memorandum and my recollection of the meeting.
Absolutely.
There are 5 people, including our chief counsel, our L&L, and 3 of the most capable analysts we have. There's no reason now there could be a mistake. My memory could have gone, but the memo stands as recorded, and we'll be certainly glad to memorandum on the documenting the meeting.
Is that your recollection as well?
Yes, sir.
As well as
Yes,
Jim Schufeld's that names were mentioned?
Yes,
Do you
sir.
recall us discussing names?
I recall because we discussed it. And I had at that time some ongoing meetings with Billy Hendon, who I don't mean to impute his character, but he wasn't above making a statement like that, and I think you'll find that he made that statement.
Well, he didn't make it in that meeting as far as I'm concerned, and I sat there, so I guess it's my word against yours, General.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Let me
just say, how many others were there with you and make the same? 5, thank you.
Well, Mr. Waple was there, Mr. McCain, and you weren't here in the room, and he has just indicated by phone that he does not recall it, and he was Mark Smith's attorney. So we have three people who are saying that.
What will happen is, in the course of our investigative effort, these particular incidents will be taken a look at. I think it's important for the committee not to get sidetracked here. The tape episode, it did not pan out. It's a matter of history. No money was paid. No tape has ever been produced. And the committee, from its judgment, is going to sort of take into account where we are with respect to that.
Well, I might just say, Mr. Chairman, I didn't bring it up. It came up from General Peroots, and I might just say it's interesting. The memorandum for the record, 5 March, subject is Mark Smith caper. It's not the tape. It's the Mark Smith caper. Needless to say, some conclusions were drawn prior to the investigation being completed.
Mr. Chairman, just for the record, Mr. Perot was out $45,000. It probably doesn't matter much to him, but there was money exchanged in that issue.
He put the money out because the U.S. government refused to do it, even though the U.S. government wanted the tape and encouraged Mr. Perot to do it, and frankly, not only encouraged him, but not in the exact sense, but in one sense, hired him to do it, directed him to do it, and he was willing to provide those funds. And as it turned out, it did not turn out to produce a tape.
The fact is, he was out $45,000.
That is correct. It is.
Okay, gentlemen, let's proceed along. I think the tape episode has had a significant airing. I think the committee has a pretty good understanding of what took place with it, and I think it's important for us to move on. Gentlemen, there are a number of areas that we are not going to go into now simply because of the time that we may want some additional comments on, and we will leave the record open, and I know that each of you will obviously be available to help us complete that record. Also, Mr. Childress, we would like to pick up with you in closed session on that important issue of the offer and non-offer or whatever, but that does need to be examined by the committee. And I take it you could be available in short order to do that?
Yes.
All right.
You mean today or?
Probably not today, but fairly short.
Sure.
Thank you very much. I appreciate each of you being present. Thank you for helping us to get an understanding of this issue, and we look forward to following up with you to help us complete the record. If I could ask for the next panel of Senator Howard Baker and Mr. Jim Cannon, please.
Oh, yeah. Well, the businessman, yeah. That's right. No, you're right.
Morning, Senator. Just come on in over here. Why don't you come in over by your places here? Thank you very much. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you.
We want to know what you knew and when you knew it.
Not in this room.
Senator McCain has already underscored both the irony, but more importantly, really our pleasure in welcoming you back here, Senator. I notice you are accompanied by a counsel who has, not you, but Mr. Cannon is, I think, but he is here with you in your party, Fred Thompson, who has had no small introduction to this room. But we're particularly grateful to you for coming back. I'm very sensitive to the fact that this is the first time you've ever been asked to raise your right hand and take an oath to tell the truth. There isn't any question in the committee's mind that you would not do that. but I want to express our appreciation to you for your willingness to share your thoughts with us on this and to do it under oath. The committee would like to make clear that the reason all the testimony is being taken under oath, even from those we know well and trust, is that we want this record to be one at the end that no one can say, well, you didn't take so-and-so's testimony in a sworn fashion. And we want our record to be, hopefully, as incapable of impeachment as possible. So thank you for helping the Senate, as you always have helped the Senate, to fulfill its responsibilities. We're very pleased to have you back here, though I regret it is as a witness in anything. But again, in keeping with your tradition of service, you didn't hesitate, and you're here, and we're grateful to you for that. I can assure you, yourself, Senator Baker, and Mr. Cannon, that this will not be long and it will not be difficult, but we do want to try to complete the record as to what happened in the course of the 1980s during the brief span when you had responsibilities in the White House, and to help us understand the White House's view of both Mr. Perot's efforts as well as this issue at that particular moment in time. Senator Smith, do you have any opening at this point?
No, I don't, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Welcome, Senator Baker. It's been a long time since I've...
Thank you.
We welcome opening comments from both of you, and Senator Baker, if you would lead off.
Mr. Chairman, I have no opening comment. I thank you for your remarks. I'll be pleased to answer your questions.
Nor do I have any opening comments, Senator, but I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. Then, if I could begin, let me just ask you to lead off what you understood to be, well, first of all, Senator Baker, what period of time did you serve as Chief of Staff in the White House?
Mr. Chairman, I was called by President Reagan in late February, the last few days of February 1987, to come to Washington. Without assigning a reason for it. I agreed to do that and did, and as soon as I got to the White House, the President indicated to me that he needed a new Chief of Staff and wanted me to do it. I had conjured up all sorts of reasons why I shouldn't come back into the government in case he should ask me that, but all those reasons disappeared and dissipated as soon as he asked, and I immediately agreed to do it, and I'm glad I did it. I think my official service at the White House begins on March 2nd. Actually, I was there a few days before that. I had planned to come to work, I believe, on Monday, which I believe was March 2nd. But my predecessor, Don Reagan, left over the weekend, and I received a call that nobody was in charge, and I had to come down over the weekend, and somebody had to be in charge. So I did that. And if my memory serves me, that was on February 28th or thereabouts, anyway, on that weekend. And by taking charge, I really only appeared and gathered up what senior staff was present and told them that I would be there on Monday and for them to continue with their responsibilities. So I leave it up to you to decide whether I came February 28th or March 2nd, but that's the approximate date. I agreed with the President to serve a limited time as his Chief of Staff. I was determined to return to private life, which I did. But we had a tacit understanding that I'd be there about a year. As it turned out, I served about a year and a half. By mutual agreement, the President and I set the time immediately after the second summit with Mr. Gorbachev, which was the Moscow summit, as time for my departure, and I was then succeeded by Ken Duberstein, who previously had been my deputy. Ken served for about 6 months for the remainder of the Reagan term. But that's a thumbnail sketch of my service as Chief of Staff.
Thank you, Senator. How did you first come into contact with the POW MIA issue in your role as Chief of Staff?
Well, you know, I served here for 18 years, and I was Republican leader for 8 of those 18 years, so, you know, it was not a new issue to me. I was exposed to it regularly from the Senate point of view. From the Congressional point of view, I had no great depth of understanding of the issue, nor any particular reason to, but it came up in conversation and debate on the floor and committee proceedings, so I had some general understanding of the difficulties we were having with the Vietnamese on trying to identify our MIAs or potential POWs still remaining in Vietnam. When I arrived at the White House, however, maybe I ought to take just a minute to tell you how it operated. The Chief of Staff to the President of the United States is not a statutory position. It is by designation of the President as his most senior staff assistant. The President also has, as you and the committee know, a National Security Advisor who is head of the National Security Council. The organizational tree probably shows the National Security Advisor reporting through the Chief of Staff, but in actuality, that's not the way it works. The way it works is the Chief of Staff and the National Security Advisor work as a team and each have their own particular areas of responsibility. By way of saying that I had no direct responsibility for this issue, for the POW MIA issue. My job was to try to get the White House operating on an even keel. March of 1987 was not exactly the high point of the Reagan presidency. And I did a lot of things. I asked Jim Cannon, who had been my Chief of Staff as Republican leader in the Senate, to come and help me figure out what staff was there and to recommend organizational chart. Jim agreed to do that. He did not want to come in as an employee, so he came as a volunteer. My job at that point then was to try to advise the President on organization, on the direction of his future policy as he prescribed it, or in the organization of his staff, and to interface with the National Security Council, at that time Frank Carlucci, on other matters. But I was so consumed with the depth of my responsibility that I really was not exposed initially to the POW-MIA issue. Every morning at 9 o'clock I had a meeting with the President. Every morning at 9:30 there was a meeting between the President and the National Security Advisor, which I attended. And every morning at 9:30 we discussed matters of national security interest, and I was essentially an observer in that context. But in those meetings I heard repeatedly the President's anguish, I guess is the best word for it, about our POW-MIAs, and I heard that often. I heard conversation by Carlucci and Powell with the President on that issue from time to time, but once again that was not my essential responsibility, so I did not take notes, and I was not deeply involved in that except as an observer. The first time I became involved with the POW-MIA issue in a direct way was sometime in March of 1987. In March of 1987, as my memory serves, Frank Carlucci and Colin Powell both came to my office and said that they'd like to take up with the President the matter of my talking to Perot on the telephone with respect perhaps to his involvement in Vietnam, or maybe a trip, I don't remember the details. That was brought up at the 9:30 meeting that day. The President agreed, as I remember, with Carlucci and Powell that I would make that phone call.
Could I just interrupt you there for a moment? Had there been any prior contact between you and Mr. Perot on this subject?
No, not that I remember. I don't recall ever having talked to Mr. Perot prior to that telephone conversation I'm about to relate.
When you first discussed the issue with Secretary Carlucci and
General Powell.
General Powell at the time, was there an understanding of what Mr. Perot's role was to be, or of what his role was with respect to this issue and the White House?
Well, I don't know quite how to answer that. My knowledge of it was very limited indeed. And the burden of my telephone call to Ross Perot at the President's request was based on advice given to me by Carlucci and Powell and consisted essentially of these elements. One, if you can go to Vietnam and see a live prisoner, as they apparently had suggested, then of course you should go. But if you go, you should understand that you're going as a private citizen, not as an official of this government, nor a presidential representative. And if you go, support my choice, the President's choice, of General Vesey as my sole authority to negotiate. Because Vesey is the chosen instrument, so to speak, of the administration to try to negotiate on the discovery and release, if discovered, of POWs and MIAs. Those are really the essential points I made in that telephone conversation.
And this was the conversation between you and Ross Perot?
It was. I placed the call through the White House switchboard.
Originally, Frank Carlucci and Colin Powell had telephoned you, though, with respect to Perot?
Well, I don't remember where they called me or where they came to my office. My recollection is dim, but I think they came to my office, which is just a few feet away from their office. And that wasn't unusual for them to stop by my office on the way to a meeting in the Oval Office.
Was there a sense, Senator, then that this invitation that Ross Perot had to go to Vietnam and his potential journey, that it somehow represented a problem to be dealt with, or was it an opportunity to be taken advantage of?
Well, that, of course, is beyond the scope of my knowledge. I can give you my impression. This is not based on fact or recollection, but my impression is that some way or other the President or Carlucci and Powell had ascertained that Perot intended to go to Vietnam, and that in advance of that trip they wished to lay down these markers. If you go, you're going as a private citizen. If you go, you shouldn't go unless they perform on what apparently they represented to be an offer to show him a live POW. And when you get there, support Vesey. My impression is that it was initiated on the recommendation of the NSC to put those points in Mr. Perot's mind before he went. But I do not know what preceded that. I don't know what conversations there had been between Powell and Carlucci. I just don't know the detail.
I understand, I see the light, but I suggest that you continue the line of questioning that you are pursuing for the purposes of continuity and disregard of the time. If that's agreeable.
Thank you, Senator. I'll do that. Now, did you at that time assign, let me just put this in context. The reason this is important, obviously, is we're trying to understand the context in which a number of allegations have been made to the committee. We're trying to understand what the dynamics were of the administration at the time on the issue. And obviously, we're trying to understand what, if anything, may have affected Vietnam's production of information and or its policies with respect to our policies. And so that is the reason for the pursuit of this line of questioning. In a memorandum, which I'm going to ask Mr. Cannon about in a little while, and this is a memorandum for the files which Vice President Bush personally typed based on a phone call from Ross Perot on March 21st of 1987. In it, I'll just take one sentence of it for the moment, and it may be, Mr. Cannon, that you have a better recollection as to this, because I believe you have already been questioned about it, but also you're familiar with it. The Vice President, the President now, said at the time, I reminded Ross that I had told him that his suggestion of a special negotiator had been approved. I told him the name of the negotiator. So I take it that that Perot had actually suggested this approach, but the President chose John Vesey. Is that accurate?
I can't tell you, Senator. I'm not privy to that.
Do you recall, Mr. Cannon?
I do not specifically, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Perot told me that he had been encouraged much earlier, long before Senator Baker and I came to the White House. He had been encouraged to look into the matter and report back to President Reagan. All I knew was what he had told me.
You're talking about his review of the files, I take it, at the time?
I didn't know that much about the review of the files, just that the President asked him to look into it.
So, at that point in time, it was your understanding that Ross Perot had his own connection to the President and to others on this issue, and you were presented with a situation where you needed to deal with his current state of mind or interpretation with respect to the relationship with the White House.
You know, Senator, I don't mean to be evasive at all, and I'm sure you'll understand that I just didn't know anything at all, except that I'd been asked by Carlucci and Powell to make this phone call. And I thought enough of that, and it was unusual enough, so that I want to be very precise and careful about what I said. And it may be, I have some flickering memory, that I actually wrote down proposed notes while I was still in the Oval Office of what I was going to say. But I do remember clearly that I wanted to be very precise and that I discussed it at length with Carlucci and Powell. But I must tell you, I simply do not know the background. I do not know really what the Vice President knew before I got there. The President knew what contacts had been made, what Perot said. And before that phone call, I don't think I ever talked to Ross Perot in my life.
Okay. Now, did Mr. Cannon make any reports about Mr. Perot's activities to either Secretary Carlucci or to General Powell, to your knowledge?
Are you asking me that?
Yes, sir.
I would yield to Jim Cannon for that.
In a general sense, Mr. Chairman, Senator Baker handed me the problem, and there were a lot of other problems at that point.
What was the problem? Define it to me. You call it a problem.
The problem to me was that, as I recall, Senator Baker said, and he did know that I knew Mr. Perot for some 15 years at that point. He asked me to take this problem and see what I could do with it, that Mr. Perot had some sense that he could help find prisoners of war in Vietnam, that he had been encouraged by the President and the Vice President to be involved in this, and that something had happened to make him unhappy about the situation, as though he were not either receiving recognition or authority, and that I should look into it, talk to Mr. Perot, see what the problem was, and see if I could work it out.
I think I can shed a little light on that, Mr. Chairman. I think Jim will probably recall this, but we'll see. Shortly after I made that phone call, maybe the next day, to Ross Perot, the Vice President stopped me, as I remember, in the corridor between our offices and said Perot had called him, I think, and that he didn't like the idea that I called him instead of the Vice President called him. It was after that, I guess, that I talked to Cannon about it, since I knew Jim knew Perot, and I did not know Perot. I think Cannon's words that I handed it off to him is apt, because it was not a formal assignment. He was not an employee of the U.S. government. And I don't remember what I said, but my guess is that I said, Jim, look into this, and you know the man and I don't, and see what's going on. But I don't recall that. I do not offer that as testimony before this committee, except as speculation.
Well, I'd like to understand was there a sense at that point in time that Ross Perot's efforts were somehow interfering with the track that the White House perceived it was on?
Senator Kerry, I must tell you, I cannot answer that question for you. I suppose that's the implication in what I've already told you. It is perhaps the fair intent of the request from Carlucci and Powell to me to make this phone call and make these points, and the President's concurrence in that recommendation. But my mind, my experience, my knowledge on this subject is zero prior to the request to make this, as far as I recall.
Ross Perot did go to Vietnam.
He did, but I didn't know that until later.
What time did you come to learn it?
Well, My memory's vague about that, too. After the March phone call, Jim Cannon arranged a dinner at the Madison Hotel with me and with Ross Perot, and I do not remember that I was told at that meeting that he'd already been to Vietnam, but it doesn't make sense unless I was, because there was a lot of stuff discussed that clearly imply that he'd been there, so I assume that he did tell me that at the time.
Mr. Cannon, did you have a different or similar recollection with respect to Mr. Perot's mission to Vietnam?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I did. I think it was only a day or two after I had entered the picture. I had a general sense of it from Mr. Perot's point of view, because I had talked to him and he had told me in summary that he knew live prisoners were there and he believed he could get them out, but that the bureaucracy was trying to impede him. And subsequent to that, or the next day, I talked to General Powa to get the administration side of it. And General Powa gave me a summary briefing of all the efforts that had been going on over the years to try to find prisoners, if so, if they found them, get them out.
At that point in time, did you have an opinion yourself regarding the likelihood that people were alive in Vietnam?
I did not have any information whatsoever about that.
When Ross Perot told you he thought he could bring live prisoners out, what was your reaction?
My reaction was that I was skeptical, Mr. Chairman, but if there were a slight possibility that there was one prisoner alive in Vietnam, we ought to do our damnedest to get him out.
Did you inquire of General Powell whether or not he believed or had any intelligence that suggested that someone was alive in Vietnam?
I don't remember asking him that question specifically.
Did either of you engage in any analysis within the White House at that time of the Perot allegations about live people?
I did not, Mr. Chairman.
I did not, Mr. Chairman. Let me add also that since I was a volunteer, I could not see classified information, so that was something that out of my reach.
Did you Mr. Cannon, did you then help make arrangements for Ross Perot to go?
No, Mr. Chairman, the sequence of events, as I remember them, is that on, I believe, it was a Saturday morning, I believe it's the 21st of March. I was in the office that morning and either by phone or in person had a conversation with General Powell, who said in sum, the next time you talk to Mr. Perot, see if he will use his influence. He had told me that he was talking with Vietnamese representatives, I believe in New York, though he did not say their names. General Powell asked me to ask Mr. Perot if he would use his influence to encourage the Vietnamese to accept General Vesey as the senior U.S. representative to go into Vietnam. Later that afternoon, Mr. Perot called me, I believe at home, and we had, I believe it's the most extended discussion of his concern, in which he went into some length of his efforts over the years and his frustration at bureaucracy not giving him more assistance. An hour or so later, sometime that evening, he called me again, apparently according to notes that I made at the time, and I then talked to him about General Vesey, the importance of getting General Vesey in, and at the end of the conversation, he told me that he was going in on his own and in its private status.
Now, is this referencing the documents here? I think you've provided us with a summary of your talking notes for your call, is that correct? For your call to Ross Perot on March 21st, 1987?
I did provide that document, Mr. Chairman, if I may have a minute to find it.
While you're looking, let me just read from it. The fifth paragraph says, "It has not been going well with those in Hanoi, and our emissaries have not been in contact with anyone who will commit to a visit by a high-level U.S. citizen."
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman.
That's right. Take your time. Take your time.
Does it have a date?
Yes, March 21st, 87. We should have had them numbered. I apologize. It's about halfway through the document packet. Talking points for call to Ross Perot is the title, half a page.
Saturday, March 21, 1987, talking points for telephone call to Ross Perot.
Yes, sir.
From Colin Powell. Yes, sir, I do have that document.
The fifth paragraph suggests that things were not going well with Hanoi. The reason, again, I ask this is that Perot has suggested that, in fact, his visit was helpful. There's some question about where we were in our contacts with Hanoi and our ability to achieve anything then. In your summary, you say it has not been going well with those in Hanoi, and our emissaries have not been in contact with anyone who will commit to a visit by a high-level U.S. citizen.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I must be looking at another document because I don't find that in my fifth paragraph.
Let me provide you here. You want to provide, would you please provide Mr. Cameron with the appropriate?
There you go.
Was this simply an effort to dissuade him from going?
Not on my part.
Were you instructed to try to dissuade him to go? I mean, this basically suggests that you folks didn't want him to go.
Was I
instructed to try to dissuade him to
dissuade him? Dissuade him. No, I had no instructions on that point, Mr. Chairman. It had never come up, and frankly, until he told me he was going, it never occurred to me that, not seriously anyway, that he might go on his own.
Well, the second to last paragraph says, in fact, right now, the best interests of the U.S. government might be served if you were not to go to Hanoi at this time.
Mr. Chairman, I'm terribly sorry. I cannot find that in this page. Is it, I see Memcon Ross Perot, continued page 2.
No, this is the headline is talking points. Could we please make sure that the witness has?
I have talking points for telephone call to Ross Perot, 32187.
That's correct.
And
there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 bullets with little circles in front of them. It's half page. You don't have that?
No, sir, I do not have that.
We have a vote now. I tell you what, we have a vote on right now. Why don't, well, staff, make sure you have each of these documents properly in front of you. We'll just take a momentary recess while we vote, and we'll be right back. Stand.
No, I must say, things don't change, do they?
Bill? We'll find out. All right. The hearing will come back to order. Thank you very much for your patience. Appreciate it. I think we can move through this fairly rapidly, and now that we're situated in the documents here, I think we can begin to pull this together a little bit. And I don't want to prolong something that doesn't have to be prolonged. You now identify those notes as in fact being Craig Fuller's notes. Is that correct?
Correct.
Craig Fuller's recommendations to you.
That
They are
is
your
correct.
notes taken on a call you had with Craig Fuller.
They were points that Craig Fuller
Gave you to talk to Perot
me, suggesting talking points for the next conversation I might have with Mr. Perot.
So does that now suggest to you that in fact Craig Fuller, on the part of the President, Vice President, wanted you to articulate that they didn't think it was the best interests of the U.S. for Ross Perot to go to Hanoi?
It does indicate that, Mr. Chairman. I should add that I
Does that refresh your recollection at all as to any concerns the White House had expressed or that you all had talked about with respect to Mr. Perot's visit?
I don't believe that I had talked about it. In fact, except for that, I had not thought there was the prospect that Mr. Perot would go unless he went as the President's representative, because that was the essence of his conversation to me, that he thought he should be designated to go.
Is it fair to say that at that point in time the White House was giving a mixed message to Ross Perot, that he was getting a sense from the President that, gee, it's okay, and the Vice President, you ought to be involved, but on the other hand, the NSC and others were very concerned about his potential visit?
That's more than I know about it, Mr. Chairman. Internally, for myself, I was talking with several people. I had some contact with Craig Fuller, but my principal person I talked with was General Powa, and I was listening to his articulation of the recommendations, and at the same time trying to form my own judgment, because it was essentially my view, Mr. Chairman, that there was no lack of interest on the part of either side, either Mr. Perot or certainly people in the White House, as to the interest in the matter. My feeling was the question of which way do we go, who is going to have the responsibility, who is going to take it on as a prime assignment. My feeling in the middle, so to speak, of this was that instead of working in competition, we ought to work in parallel, that Mr. Perot could be helpful and that he might actually advance the government's operation, the government's effort to find people and get them out.
You presented us with some documents, among which is this personally typed vice presidential memorandum for the files, typed by Vice President Bush, in which he says, reading from it, "A frustrated Ross Perot called me. He requested the name of the Vietnam Politburo member that the U.S. government was negotiating with in order to get the Vietnamese to accept the Bessie role as mediator. Ross detailed a litany of gripes. He never got the green light on his advance trip to Vietnam. Note, this is the first I've ever heard that he requested such a green light, close paren. I send the advance people in anyway," and so forth. Ross, referring to Ross, he's upset because the government's top two people got me into this, i.e. Ronald Reagan and George Bush. In fact, he has a little RR and GB in parentheses there. I believe he's sort of quoting Perot. "I could never get an answer or anything." He says, "I tried through Carlucci. Carlucci says, would you get off Armitage's back if we appoint a negotiator? I reminded Ross that I had told him that his suggestion of a special negotiator had been approved. I told him the name of negotiator," so forth. Ross, who heretofore repeatedly told me and Fuller that he would not go to Vietnam unless he was told that he would see live POWs, then stated that his people were now telling him it might take 2 or 3 trips to achieve this end. Now, first of all, could I ask you, how is it that you presented us with this document? Was this something you kept in your files or that you've been given recently?
This was something that I found in my files, Mr. Chairman, after I was notified that I might be asked to contribute whatever I might know about this, these happenings at that time.
Well, there's some evidence to suggest, at least some evidence in front of the committee, to suggest that the National Security Council was in some disarray with respect to their communications with the Vietnamese and ability to move the process forward. You, in your talking points from Craig Fuller, allude to that, where it says that our people are having trouble getting into Hanoi. Ross Perot alludes to that, in fact, saying that you couldn't get there and he was the one who got in. I'm trying to determine whether in fact that's true, that the NSC at that time was kind of in gridlock or in dissension on this Ross Perot visit.
I did not perceive that, Mr. Chairman. I do not believe that I talked to anyone in the NSC at that time but General Powell. But in terms of his candor with me and mine with him, I saw no confusion in the ranks on what they should do.
So you personally saw no problem in Ross Perot going down his track?
This track means?
Going to Vietnam.
No, I simply did not know that, Mr. Chairman. I thought there was a serious possibility that Mr. Perot, through his Vietnamese contacts, might assist the government's operation in getting General Vesey or someone, some other team into Vietnam to move this proceedings along.
Well, Mr. Cannon, do you see my confusion here? On the one hand, we have Craig Fuller telling you that you should advise Ross Perot not to go.
Yes.
Not in the best interest of the United States. But on the other hand, you have Ross Perot saying that the NSC couldn't get in there. And you had no way of getting the Vesey appointment confirmed with the Vietnamese because they weren't talking to anybody. They weren't receiving anybody.
Mr. Chairman, I can maybe say a word about that. Once again, may I say, this is speculation on my part, but it's based on my impressions. I don't think there's any confusion there. I think that the long and short of it is that Ross, who was a dedicated, patriotic American who really believed that there were POWs and MIAs over there, thought he ought to be the negotiator. And the NSC and the President thought that Vesey ought to be the negotiator. And they had a difference on approach. The approach was, as far as I understand it, that Perot thought that perhaps if you did a few symbolic things like letting the piano player tour and General Giap lecture at the War College, that it might produce a result. And the NSC and the President's position was that if we got to negotiate at all, they got to first make an accounting of our POWs and MIAs. It's an honest difference of opinion between patriotic men and women. But I don't see any confusion. I think the difficulty that some of us saw was that perhaps that the Vietnamese might be confused, not that we'd be confused, and that if you had Perot and Vesey both working on it, they might play them off against each other and wait for the highest bid. Now that's my overall impression, and honestly, the impression is formed as much after the fact as it was before the fact. But I was there a long time, and I know the people involved, and that is my general impression.
Well, I might add that the self-typed memcon of the Vice President with his conversation with Ross Perot seems to support the notion that Perot might have anticipated being the negotiator, because it says, quote, in the Friday meeting at the UN, my guys brought up Vesey as negotiator. This is the conversation with Perot. The Vice President quoting Perot as saying, I'm glad to have Vesey substitute for me. I'm very high on Vesey, as I've told you. He is then quoted as saying, I suppose Craig told you that I'm severing all ties with the Reagan administration. Did he mention the Reagan Library? Vice President goes on to say, I assured Ross that indeed Craig had filled me in. Ross again repeated his concern about going as a private citizen. They'd like to grab me as the ultimate hostage, quote. With no government sponsorship, he felt he'd be fair game for kidnapping. Quote, all I ask is the name of the guy in the Politburo. Howard Baker told me someone was over there right now negotiating. Parentheses, some speculation it might be Childress. So I take it that Ross Perot apparently in the same conversation as discussing Vesey substituting for him is discussing severing all ties with the Reagan administration and something about the Reagan Library. Are you familiar with that?
It certainly sounds that way. I'm familiar with another development in that respect, but not about that. I know that if you want me to go into that now, I'll be happy to do that.
Be delighted.
Later on, there was a request, I think, through the NSC by Perot to see the president and to bring Judge Clark, Bill Clark, with him, and maybe the First Lady, Nancy Reagan. And that came across my desk, and I said, no, we're not going to do that. Clark is chairman of the Reagan Library Foundation, and we're not going to mix that up in anything. And I put the kibosh on that. I told they couldn't do that, and I called Bill Clark and told him that I had denied the request for him and the First Lady to meet with Perot if and when we set up a meeting with the President. The President never, ever intended in this or anything else to mix fundraising for the Reagan Library with policy, and this by direction or implication. And it was in furtherance of that policy that I told Clark he couldn't come.
Mr. Cannon, can you help me understand, turning to two documents. This is a 3/21/87 memo at 3:40 p.m. Telcon with Colin Powell.
Yes, I have it.
First sentence, Colin says he's heard that Ross is making calls again. Are you with me? Same document? Yeah. Okay. Turning down to the third from the last bullet. This is a bullet that greatly concerns me. Is this your memo?
No, sir. This is not my memo. This is Craig Fuller's memo.
You're familiar with it, though?
I am.
In what context are you familiar with it?
I'm familiar with it because it was given me at the time, and it was one of several pieces of guidance that I was given as how I might deal with Mr. Perot and what I might say to him.
Did you have occasion to talk with Craig Fuller about these talking points?
I do not remember that I did, and the cover note suggests that he sent them over to me and said he would be home that night if he could be of any help. I do not recall talking with him.
So this is Craig Fuller's Telcon,
right,
with Colin Powell.
Right.
Well, we should probably talk to Craig Fuller about it, but maybe you can help us understand. Let me quote the paragraph. We still believe that it is not wise for Ross to go. After 14 years, they have denied live Americans. If they were to produce live people, can you imagine what will be asked for? Now, that is, to me, a remarkable reason not to have Ross Perot go.
I simply don't know the answer to that, Mr. Chairman, because this was a conversation between Mr. Fuller and Mr. Powell.
But you would agree with me that it reads almost as if you don't want to find live people because of the consequence of what might go with it.
I can see your point, Mr. Chairman, but that I did not read it that way.
You have no understanding then of what, the reason I ask you of this is in the packet that you gave us.
I understand.
So I wanted to understand if you had any further understanding of this or any other contact with it. any other communication with either of the participants in it.
Mr. Chairman, could I say a word on that?
Absolutely, Senator Baker.
I have no personal knowledge of the MemCon, but I know firsthand that President Reagan was dedicated, painfully dedicated, to pursuing any lead that he could find on POWs and MIAs in Vietnam. I know that Frank Carlucci and Colin Powell spent a great deal of time on this subject, and that I came to have great confidence in their judgment. I cannot imagine that there was any reluctance to find POWs or MIAs in Vietnam for any purpose that would be consistent with what I've just said.
It would be my absolute assumption, and I wouldn't want to think otherwise. Obviously, when a sentence like that appears in a memo, it feeds the notions of people's worst suspicions about this issue, is all I'm suggesting. And I think, you know, I'm sure there's a clarification of it. I was just hoping we could try to get it now, but.
Could I say I agree with the chairman's point, but I also think that Senator Baker's point is reinforced by the fact that the president approved of a military operation into Laos in 1981, which I think is certainly significant evidence of his commitment to trying to resolve the issue.
I can understand. It may well be that this is said in the context only of Ross Perot visiting. That if Ross Perot turned somebody, what would they ask of Ross Perot, or what would, I mean, there's a number of contexts, so I don't want to leave it hanging out there in a wrong context. But I was just wondering if you could help us understand that context.
I had not focused to that extent on it until you mentioned it, Mr. Chairman, but it was then, there was no question in my mind, I had the strongest feeling that everyone in the White House, I had not talked to the President about it, but I had heard from Senator Baker, and I knew from Craig Fuller, and I may have talked with the Vice President, I'm not sure, but I had seen his memos, and I felt strong that Colin Powell, that all involved in the White House would do anything and everything prudent and reasonable to find out if there were prisoners of war in Vietnam, and if so, do whatever we could to get them out.
Let me ask you, this will be a sort of last question for me, but I want to try to, one of the principal reasons for asking both of you gentlemen to be here today is to try to understand the dynamics that were in the White House then and what the realities were of the Perot trip versus the realities of the administration policy. Perot alleges there was no policy. On the contrary, yesterday he agreed that the policy was not to give them anything. So the policy wasn't his policy, but it was a policy. Now, it appears through the testimony of General Powell in his deposition that there was, in fact, confusion. And that ultimately that had to be cleared up, which is why Ross Perot met with the President. The President basically said to Ross Perot, you've been terrific, we appreciate your participation, but we're going to handle it from here. Thank you. And what led to that, and I want the record to try to be clear on this and need your help to understand it, is that, as General Powell said, and this is a question from his deposition that was asked of him, once the officials in the administration began being concerned that Mr. Perot's policies and the administration policies were different, which officials were concerned about that? How high up did it go? General Powell's answer: we became concerned in the NSC that we had a situation that was becoming difficult, if not intolerable. We couldn't keep this thing going, and particularly when he has on his own volition gone to Vietnam, and how he represented himself once he got there. I'm sure he probably gave the impression to the Vietnamese that he was acting in some official capacity. And so he then returns and he has a report that he wishes to give to the President, and he wishes to see the President on this matter and is persistent in his desire to see the President. This all comes together to suggest that we've got to clean this up once and for all, and we can't allow this dual-track confusion to exist any longer.
Mr. Chairman, it's clear from reading General Powell's deposition and from your summary on yesterday of the situation, which I read in the newspaper, that indeed there was confusion, but it was confusion by the Vietnamese. There was no confusion that I'm aware of within the White House administration, but it is obvious, I think, that if Perot had one set of ideas about how to settle the issue and the administration had another, that the Vietnamese are going to go to the highest bidder. And it might prolong the negotiations or, in fact, defeat them. But once again, you know, I think Ross Perot is a patriotic man who was really dedicated to trying to get them back, and that he did more than the private citizen would be expected ever to do. But he was a man of great resources, great intellect, and great patriotism. But the fact of the matter is, he and the president had two different views of how best to get these people back. And the president is the president, and finally you have to decide that. And that's what happened is, in the meeting that we arranged for the president to see Perot.
I might add that that is confirmed in the last question asked of General Powell. The question was, the rationale for that was so the Vietnamese would not, i.e. the rationale for the meeting with Perot to tell him thank you, was so the Vietnamese would not get a mixed signal and they could not pick and choose between the administration. And the answer of General Powell was everybody had a mixed signal. I mean, the whole thing was mixed up at that point. I assume everybody in Washington was curious as to who was doing what to whom, and it was also necessary that the president's emissary go without any other emissaries, presidential or real or apparent or otherwise, being around. If you do that to somebody, you're in negotiations with you, you're giving them an opportunity to play people off. It was time to bring these proceedings to a close and let it be clear to the Vietnamese that General Vesey is our emissary, our only emissary. He's speaking in the name of the administration, and the president is carrying that charter, and Mr. Perot is not. You concur with that?
It's a gratuitous remark for me to make, but I can't resist making it when I say that uncertainty about who was doing what to whom was not just in the foreign policy field. And when I got to the White House in March of 1987, the first thing that I tasked the staff to do was to write a plan, a detailed plan, every day for the president's activities for 60 days, and ask the president to sign off, because there was an impression abroad that things were loose from their moorings. And we had to change that. And obviously that was an impression as well in the field of foreign policy that had to be brought to a head as well, and that's exactly what Powell and Carlucci were recommending. By the way, I've never known two greater public servants than Carlucci and Powell, and I think both of them are great. I think Colin Powell is a real national treasure. Frank Carlucci was a great Secretary of Defense as well, but I served with both of them, and I confess to prejudice, but I think they were both extraordinary public servants.
Well, I think the committee would roll over and play dead to that one. No question about it. Just a final question, if I can, Mr. Cannon, because I want the record to be fair and clear also with respect to Mr. Perot. While the White House felt that Mr. Perot was getting in the way in terms of sending a mixed signal, it is fair, is it not, to say that he accomplished something in his visit that did allow the process to go forward? And I specifically refer to your memorandum to Senator Baker of April 12, 1987, in which you suggest some of the confusion in the first paragraph, but then say the following. What is most important now is the broader issue. At this point in the broader issue is that NSC or Defense concluded that General Vesey should go to Hanoi as senior negotiator. Perot has cleared the way for General Vesey's acceptance by the Vietnamese. So I recommend the following. You issue a press release, acknowledge that Perot has studied the issue, made a recommendation for the appointment of a senior negotiator. You've accepted the Perot recommendation, and then you say, to do so may cost something in personal sensitivities. Acknowledging in an honest way, I think, what was happening here, but then suggesting it's the most expeditious way to get going. So I think it helps us to sort of understand and bring this thing full circle, that there is an appropriate acknowledgement that notwithstanding the reluctance to have Perot go, he did wind up getting Vesey accepted. And subsequent to that, Vesey and the process got going. Is that fair?
I think it's fair.
Okay. Do you have anything to add to that, Senator Baker?
I don't think so, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Smith?
Senator Baker, I've reviewed your deposition as well as that of Mr. Cannon, and I think you've been very candid in sharing what you have in terms of knowledge on this, which we're very grateful for, and I really don't have any questions for either of you. In the interest of time, I'll be more than happy to yield to Senator McCain or back to the chair, whoever may have another question. But I do want to thank you for your candor, and I share what you said regarding Carlucci and Powell as well. I want to put that on the record. Good, two great men.
I appreciate it.
I certainly welcome you and Mr. Cannon, and I express my dismay at having to see sworn testimony, men of your character and integrity, and I understand why the committee has taken that policy. It's just unpleasant for me to have to see it. I say that personally, understanding the committee's policy. Senator Baker, I would suggest that if anybody knows about conspiracies, that it is you, sir. And I would just wonder if you had any personal views about the possibility of a conspiracy that I think would have had to have led, if not to your level as the Chief of Staff, but certainly to the next level down in order to be successful. If you think there's a possibility that that kind of thing could have been orchestrated concerning the POW-MIA issue.
Senator McCain, I think it would be utterly impossible for that to have occurred during the time I was there, not because I was there, but because I daily saw the President, talked to him at length, saw firsthand his concern about this issue. I talked daily to Carlucci, I talked to Powell every day, I talked to Schultz, I talked to Weinberger regularly. That was the top layer of the government at the time. And you couldn't have had a conspiracy without involving these people. And if I have any ability to judge human nature at all, is that these people were gravely concerned about this issue, and they were trying to rationalize a policy to maximize our chance of discovering the truth and getting people home if there were people there. I cannot think of a single thing that suggests to me that there was a conspiracy of silence or an active conspiracy or any other kind of conspiracy. Now, I can only speak on the time I was there, but I say that with great conviction for the time I was there.
And also, Senator Baker, in your capacity as the majority leader and your very early involvement dating back to the late 60s and involvement with the POW-MIA issue, and your knowledge of, although not certainly intimate workings with, the foreign policies of this country and that of other governments, I think, again, it's well to point out, and if you would agree or disagree, the reality is until basically the Cold War began to end and the Soviet Empire began to unravel, there was not a willingness on the part of the Vietnamese government to be forthcoming and assist us in resolving this issue. We hear time after time about our government didn't do this and our government didn't do that and our government may have conspired, and there was, and some of which may be true. There was a lack of attention to the issue. There was debunk live sightings, etc. But the fact is, during all those years, the Vietnamese government could have resolved the issue that quickly because they have the information. They know whether Americans are alive or dead, and if so, if they're alive, which I continue to assume, where they are and how to get them back to the United States. And I would
say that, I thought about that both prior to the White House experience and later. I have a hunch, and it's just that maybe the Vietnamese don't know either. Maybe they have confusion in their government. But the long and short of it is the war is over. And the Vietnamese, need to understand that it took us a long time in this country to realize the war was over. But I think we have done that, and I think our scars are mostly healed. But I wouldn't be surprised if theirs are still sort of open. And it may be they don't have total cooperation from their own officials or their own people. So I really think that our end result ought to be to try to end the war, normalize the relationship between this country and Vietnam. But I don't think that we dare do that until we've exhausted every possibility of finding out if there are still live American prisoners, or for that matter, retrieving their remains if they're dead. We just can't do that, you know, and it disserves the people of Vietnam, and it disserves this country for them to hold out, as you say. And if they do have division within their own ranks in Vietnam, you know, I sure hope that they'll cure that and give us a chance to get on with the business at hand. But in addition to the ultimate importance of finding out about our missing people, there is another importance, and that is trying to end the war and normalize the relations between the United States and that country. So I don't know any reason why the Vietnamese don't cooperate fully. I don't know any reason why we don't continue to hold out every opportunity for them to do that. But I would not put the cart before the horse. I would not give them a goodie before I got the reward, before I found out what they know. So I hope the Vietnamese, and you know, maybe CNN runs in Vietnam, but I would hope somebody in Vietnam would say, look, you know, there's an old Tennessee expression, you're cutting your nose off to spite your face. And what I mean by that, or what that saying says, is that they're doing things that hurt them a lot more than it hurts us. And I would hope that they'd buckle down and convince us that there aren't any, or tell us if there are, or give us the assurance that we know all there is to know.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator McCain. Senator Baker, I'll just wrap it very quickly here. The letter that was written to you from Michael Deaver on March 18th, 1987, do you have that in front of you? Are you familiar with the letter? Have you had a chance to review it?
I'm familiar with it, yes.
In that letter, Michael Deaver suggests that in his last paragraph on the first page, he says, at the heart of the problem, according to my visitors, he was writing in response to people who came to visit him, is a standoff between our nation and the Laotians and Vietnamese. We refuse to negotiate with them until all missing Americans are accounted for, a policy that perversely prevents negotiations concerning the release of Americans held prisoner. He goes on to suggest a prominent American to be appointed to carry on the task of helping resolve this issue. And this is on March 18th, 3 days before all the negotiations with Ross Perot and so forth. The logical candidate that he suggested was former President Richard Nixon, and so forth. Was General Vesey meant to sort of fill the role that is defined in that letter in his appointment, or was it decided that there would be sort of a first-tier effort at a slightly lower level and then see where things go? I mean, I just wonder what the evolution was.
I really can't tell you, Mr. Chairman. I remember the letter. I remember being surprised that it came to me instead of to the NSC. But then I remember that Mike Deaver and I have been friends for a long time, even before President Reagan was elected. I don't remember that I turned it over to Powell or Carlucci, but almost certainly I would. Anything that came across my desk that involved them, invariably I sent it to them. Whether Vesey was the fulfillment of the Deaver recommendation in lieu of Nixon, I can't tell you. I really just don't know. I'm sorry.
Okay. You have no recollection that you could share with the committee then about, well, let me strike that and ask it this way. Looking at this issue as you have, both as a member of this institution and also in the White House, and just reading about it as a citizen and so forth, could you share with us any thoughts about where we find ourselves today, where the committee finds itself, where the country finds itself, and how you might measure our current policy against the need to try to resolve this quickly? Is there advice you would give us? Is there a sense that you might have of ways in which this might be tackled that we haven't thought of?
You're right. I've been a lucky man in a lot of ways, Senator. I really have been all my life. But one of the great pieces of good luck was that I had a chance to see this government up close and intimate from both the congressional standpoint and the White House. And believe me, it looks very different from each end of Pennsylvania Avenue. But I don't have any particular advice for you. I want to fully support what you're doing. The Congress has just two real constitutional duties. There are others, but they're collateral. There are only two, really. One is to legislate, and the other is to oversee the faithful performance of policy by the executive department. Sometimes there's a tendency, I think, I observe, maybe even I'm guilty of, when you're in Congress, to try to want to substitute your judgment for the president's judgment and sort of be president. And when you're president, I can promise you there's a tendency to believe that, those folks don't know what they're doing, and if they just let us have our way, everything would be great. Maybe it's the genius of the system that those two mindsets exist, and you have to work them out. But in the final analysis, you have two duties here on the Hill. One is to legislate according to your best judgment, to set policy. And the other is to inquire diligently, regularly, and persistently into the faithful performance of that policy by the executive department. So when you asked me to testify, I was not at all reluctant to do so. I appreciate what my friend John McCain said about taking the oath, but I have no reservation about that. You're in the fulfillment of a fundamental responsibility of this branch. And I've done a lot of things in my life, but the highest position I've ever attained, the greatest public reward I ever attained, was to be a senator. So I'm happy to be here and to cooperate.
Well, thank you very much. Is there any additional questions? I really want to thank you on behalf of the committee. I hope that it will not be necessary to come back to you with any follow-up questions. As I said to you, we would try to keep this as tight and truncated as possible. I think we've really gotten the heart of what we needed to understand with respect to the policy of Mr. Perot. It may be that on a couple of details we may need to get back to both of you, and obviously would appreciate your cooperation further in that regard. You mentioned both General Powell and Secretary Carlucci as great public servants. I think we all feel that way about you, and a lot of us grew up watching your example here and appreciate enormously your continued cooperation and friendship to the effort here. So thank you for being with us today. You also share that tradition of public service. We will adjourn these hearings until September, at which time we will continue with the Paris peace talks period, and subsequently we will be looking at further intelligence data and fraud, as well as, I think, one or two other areas. But we're beginning the wind down, if you will, and I think the committee has a lot of background work to do over the course of the next few weeks. So until September, we will adjourn the public hearings, and I thank you very much for being with us today. We stand adjourned.
We have this C-SPAN program note for you. At 6:25 Eastern Time this morning, we'll bring you a speech by the new Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin. On Wednesday, Mr. Rabin addressed a gathering of the National Press Club and shared his views on U.S.-Israeli relations and the Middle East process. Meantime, if you have any questions on this hearing concerning American prisoners of war, you can write the Senate Select Committee on POW MIA Affairs. The address is 705 Hart Office Building, Washington, D.C., 20510.
Thursday, C-SPAN's Election 92 coverage features a special USA Today editorial board meeting with Democratic presidential nominee Bill Clinton. Governor Clinton will respond to questions from 5 editors of USA Today. Following the session, the editors will join us for a call-in program to discuss their meeting, and will open the phone